Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the virtual world. Come on back to your computers and we'll get you set back up. Everybody from the outside is be coming back into the room and we will get this thing kicked back off. Again, welcome back to Fort Worth, Texas, here at the Hirsch Convention Center and the 2022 VAST Global Conference. Again, throughout the day, the message is safety. We've had a great presentation on a lot of different subjects. The last one, of course, was on the power line environment. So that was a very well-received presentation. Gordy Cox did a great job of that. Lunch was fantastic for those that were here. I hope you all enjoyed that lunch. They've done a great job of that. The next presentation we're going to talk about are bird strikes. And this particular one, as you are aware, is there's a lot of policy within organizations on how they deal with the bird strikes and how you deal in flying and where the birds are. So the Gulf of Mexico is a great example where south of I-10, a lot of the organizations don't allow flight, greater than 100 knots and certain altitudes and things of that nature. So organizations and different segments of the industry recognize bird strike avoidance in different ways. We're seeing more and more safety improvements from the manufacturers as it relates to bird strike equipment or windows and things of that nature. So we're seeing a lot of effort placed on that particular topic. Has anybody in the room here, just in the general, have you guys ever had a bird strike? Anybody ever hit a bird? Did the bird actually come through the windscreen on you, or did it? No. And it's interesting. So I've hit a couple, and I know that there's it's one of those momentary things where you're wondering if there's more than one. That was at least from my perspective, is what's coming next. So it's a real issue, and I think for me one of the biggest thing is hitting a bird at night. That was one that got my greatest attention. But at this time, I'd like to introduce a few folks, and I'm gonna give you all the names, and then only one speaker will come up at a time, and then they'll announce each other as they go along. So we'll have Brad Blackwell from USDA, I'll leave it at that, USDA. He's going to be the one speaking, and he'll introduce himself on video, and that'll be momentarily. Travis DeVault with University of Georgia, and Cherry Corday, he's going to be, Cordair, I apologize, is going to be with EHA, and he'll be speaking first. So if you would come up and make your way up to the stage, and we'll turn it over to you. And one of the things that's interesting about bird strikes, you'll notice that this is a global issue. We're going to have a global discussion on this. This isn't something here that say the American birds are worse than the European birds, but the fact is they will hit us equally. So I will turn it over, and it's all yours, sir. And the clicker is right here. Will be that middle button, please. That'll be all yours.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak about that. Apology. You will hear that I am French. So my English is what it is, and my understanding too. I come from the French Navy, and does it work? Okay. And at the beginning of my career, I flew this kind of helicopter. Very old image. My God, so 32 years. Once I have experienced a bird strike with an emergency landing, not in the windscreen, but on the tip of one blade. I was not in charge of the flight. I was just a passenger for this one. It was a simple ferry flight. I was after a flight test session, and I was a flight test engineer of that, and we were returning back to our base. And 3 minutes before entering the downwind of our runway, we saw a gang of goose in a perfect flying pattern in front of us. And when they detected us, all of them died. So we were comfortable. 2 or 3 seconds after, the helicopter became a checker. A lot of vibration. No heat, we didn't know what happened. And for 2 seconds in the cockpit entered the bad question. Are we still safe enough to try to reach the base at 4 miles away? Fortunately, the pilot in command said no. And he managed for the perfect land and live process. We landed with no injury, nothing happened. But we didn't know why we have been obliged to do that. In fact, after the flight, at the inspection, I was engineer, so at the inspection of the main rotor, we saw a very small part of the blade tip in plastic that had broken off. And the post-analysis found organic materials and blood in the foam of the braking. The analysis said it was a goose. I have another experience. No. I used to be a second in command of a ship in the Navy with a helicopter. Those pictures are from this ship. And we are, in many cases, above the deck, for which I was in charge, the aircraft were surrounded by a flock of seagulls, resulting in no possible escape option for the crew. But there was no incident beside that, except a touch of concern from the crew. And for me, I was executive officer of the ship in charge of the safety. But in fact, we did that for 2-3 years in Pacific Ocean, and we didn't record any trouble with that. In fact, the seagull was not there in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. It was always next to islands, and not populated islands, with seagulls that are not accustomed with the presence of humans. They don't see that it is a danger, I suppose. But we didn't have any incident with that. So, bird strike is a problem that exists. And what can we do to promote this concern for operators teams? The first, train the ground staff and the aircrew to avoid any action that is known for attracting birds. What does it mean? For example, you need to take care of the management of your waste bins. Have sealed waste bins. The barbecue party at the threshold of the runway is probably not a good idea. At the open day of the airfield, consider with caution the option of a food truck. It is true at the airport, at the base. It is true if you have to do aerial work somewhere to prepare for work. Make sure that everybody knows how not to attract birds. The second is try to know the habits of the birds in the vicinity of the area you're working. If there is a recycling station next to your airfield, know that. Stay in touch with the manager of the station to know at what times the trucks are coming, going, they open their hangars. Do they know when they attract birds? And so and so. Try to know if in your area there are some migration if you have migration, what can I say, in the area, you must know that at what time of the day, what period of the year, in the morning, in October, in summer, what size, what they do. It's something that you must know, and you must let know your crews. And the last, if there's a wildlife preservation park, the same. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's not. I have a very recent experience to tell about you. So recent that I didn't have time to put the example on the presentation. At the heliport of Paris, the Fato is in grace, and in the morning there are always some birds, 1 or 2 dozen of birds. But last month we found thousands of birds. Oh, and it was hard to convince them to take off to clear the space. What did happen? In fact, the manager of the heliport had changed the mower for a mower with mushing system. And I asked a biologist, and he told me, oh, it is a very well-known problem. With the mushing system of the mower, it attracts worms to the surface, and worms attract their predator, so the birds. And we needed to return back to the use of the old mower with no mushing. In flight. If we are working in air safety promotion, we always reopen doors that are already opened. We reinvent the wheels, but that is our job. Keep your eyes outside and be ready to change your flight path if you can. It is not always easy. You see the bird in the picture there? There is one. Divert the left would not be a good idea. But sometimes your eyes are outside, but don't care the bird. There's something else to do for the pilot, and the pilot is alone on board for such a task. Remember that bird in the sky that feels danger is prone to dive. Often. So stay above if you can. Here it is easy. Here it is not. It is not easy, or it is not always easy to do it promptly, but do not overstress. Why? You must assume that the bird is willing, as you are, not to collide. But being convinced of that is not easy. Remember my second story? It was not easy to work with a helicopter on a ship with a lot of seagulls surrounding them. But we didn't record collision. You must keep in mind that, except regarding the horizontal speed, the flight limitation of the bird are always better than yours. The bird could be a rookie one, the pilot a very experienced one, but generally the bird's airmanship will still be better. And the instrument panel of the bird is more accurate and more reliable than yours. So, as long as you can conduct your flight without surprising the bird, the best way is often to let it manage the collision avoidance. Sometimes it works. It was my second story on board the ship. Sometimes it doesn't. Bear in mind my first story. And I asked the biologist why. It doesn't work always. It doesn't always work. But he replied me, hey, a bird is a living animal. You can meet a bird that is old, that is sick, that is tired, that is disabled, that is wounded, and that still is willing to fly. They said it was probably the case with the bird we had eaten with the lynx, because it was late. It was very behind his colleagues, and maybe he was tired or wounded or old or things like that, and he had the helicopter. So you must know that the bird is able to fly. The helicopter is able to fly at a very very higher speed than the bird. And most important, the bird warning light comes on often late, very late, according to our reference, because the bird does not instinctively identify an helicopter or an aircraft as a threat, as a predator. So he will try to stay in place as late as possible. You can have experienced that with a car. With a bird on the street, the bird will take off at the very late moment. It is the same in flight. So the conclusion is low altitude plus high speed equal increasing bird hazard. It is obvious. So, if you are in a critical moment of your flight, if it is too late, you have not detected the bird early enough. If you cannot divert your course safely alongside the mountain, for example, are you mentally prepared to consider the option to accept the collision with the bird as the best option? Instead of a CFIT, instead of a lose of control, or things like that. Are you technically equipped to manage the consequence in case of collision with a bird? You must be ready to face a bird and over the flock of birds. Are you trained to cope with such an emergency? Does your instructor mention bird strike and mitigation in the training program? Does your simulator training course incorporate bird strike training? Are you technically equipped to manage the consequence in the event of a collision of bird? What are the vulnerabilities of your aircraft? It is a brand new one with a good windscreen, or is it an heritage aircraft and you don't know? Not the best dress or eye protection face to the event, the possibility of a bird collision. That one, that's me, the same. This one is better. This one is much better. And now, I will pass the floor to my colleague, Travis. Is there? He will tell you, he is specialist in the bird life, and he will tell you if what I have said is right or not. Because, as you know, I was just the parrot of my instructors. Okay? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. So I'm Travis DeVault. I'm a research scientist at the University of Georgia, and I want to thank you for having me here to talk to you today. And I'm willing to guess this will be something very different from all the rest of your presentations here today. So bear with me here for a little bit of science. I want to acknowledge my collaborator and longtime colleague, Brad Blackwell. You'll hear from him next, but he's also a co-author on this talk. Brad and I have worked together a lot of years. And the goals for this talk, we wanted to tell you a little bit about some research we've done over the years about just why we have bird strikes. Why can't they get out of the way of aircraft? And then also just a couple brief slides on some work that we've done to try to mitigate some of these strikes. So again, something my lab has been involved in over the past several years, looking at why can't birds avoid vehicles. If you step back and think about it from the 10,000-foot view, it's really kind of perplexing. Birds have very good vision, much better than ours. Many of them hear very well too. Vehicles are big, they're noisy, they travel along a predictable path. Why can't they get out of the way? So we've done a lot of research over the years to try to figure that out. So what can the research tell us? Also, just wanted to point out briefly, I have quite a few images in this talk, like this one, first pages from peer-reviewed publications we've done, and I'll tell you at the end of the talk where you can find these if you're interested in looking any of those up. All right, so motor-powered vehicles, helicopters, aircraft, cars, they all showed up in developed parts of the world in the early 1900s, very quickly became ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So we began to wonder very early on in our research, is it possible that with all these passing vehicles animals see all the time, could they become habituated to these vehicles that don't ever chase them? So we did a study where we asked, well, across the developed world, birds observe many vehicles every day. Is it possible that birds use this experience with passing vehicles to help inform them of when they should initiate that avoidance response when a vehicle comes straight at them? So they're watching all these vehicles go by. Does that help them to decide when one's coming straight at them, when do they make that avoidance behavior? So in order to do this study, we got some pigeons. And so these are your normal city pigeons, but the thing about these pigeons that was special is that they were hatched and raised in a barn, had never seen a vehicle before our study. And we exposed these pigeons to the level of vehicles that we wanted them to be exposed to. So we put them into 3 groups, and we trained one group with a vehicle passing at 120 kilometers per hour, the second group at half that speed. The third group was our control. Those birds never saw a vehicle throughout the course, that part of the study, but they were in a covered cage and they heard these passing vehicles. I'll show you that now. Can we play that short video right there? So the birds are in the cage there on the right, and 32 times over 4 weeks, we drove by them like that. And then after we did that for over 4 weeks, we wanted to put them in a situation where they were faced with a directly oncoming vehicle to see how that experience with the passing vehicles influenced their behavior. Now, we obviously couldn't do that in real life and directly drive at them and risk hitting them. So we resorted to video playback. If you'd play that one too, please. So that we drove a virtual vehicle at them. Just like that. And video playback is awesome for this kind of research. Scientists use it with birds all the time. So you put them in a box, you drive a virtual vehicle at them, then you record their behaviors, You can score it. And what we found was that the inexperienced birds, our control group, the birds that had never before seen a vehicle in their lives before we put them in that video chamber, actually had safer responses to that oncoming virtual vehicle than the birds that were experienced with those passing vehicles. The birds that had seen those passing vehicles actually became habituated. They learned that those passing vehicle caused no threat. Now, this doesn't tell us that habituation is the cause of all bird strikes, of course, but what it does tell us is that it's a possibility. Birds can become habituated to passing vehicles. Okay, so we know that that's a possibility. That's one potential problem. Animals can become habituated to vehicles because they watch these passing vehicles all the time. So that allows vehicles that are on a collision course to approach very closely before these animals initiate that avoidance behavior. So what about vehicle speed? Well, that's another potential problem. As Terry mentioned, modern vehicles are much faster than most predators animals are used to dealing with. What if these animals are not well adapted to assess and avoid these fast-moving threats? So we did another study. And then, we do all kinds of weird things. In this one, we roamed the runways of JFK International Airport in New York over a period of years and collected all the dead birds along the runways. So we knew that these birds had been hit by aircraft, right? And what we did was we did necropsies on all these birds to find out where on the body of the bird they had been hit by those aircraft. And what we were interested in knowing was whether there was a these were random hits on the body of the bird, which would have indicated to us that the birds were blindsided. They never saw the vehicle coming, right? They were just hit. But what we found instead was that the injury locations tended to be on the ventral and posterior side of those birds. The birds saw them coming. They tried to initiate that avoidance response. They just couldn't do so in time to avoid the vehicle. Okay, so that's more evidence here that modern vehicles are fast. The birds did see them. That wasn't the problem. They tried to avoid them. They just couldn't do so in time to avoid that vehicle. So we wanted to look more into this issue of vehicle speed. And is it possible that many animals are just not fast enough to clear the path of that vehicle once they start that avoidance? So in this part of the research, we actually looked to see whether bird responses to oncoming vehicles changed across vehicle speeds. Is it possible birds miscalculate vehicle speed and then therefore initiate this avoidance behavior too late? At what vehicle speeds do these avoidance responses become ineffective? Now, if you remember back to very early this morning, if you were here, the very first speaker in today's session talked about perceptual errors that pilots sometimes have that can cause collisions or that can cause accidents, I'm sorry. Same thing here. We were looking to see whether birds might have perceptual errors when they're looking at oncoming vehicles. Okay, so again, we're looking at video playback here. Can you play that, please? But here, through the magic of video editing, we actually played vehicles approaching just like that at 8 different vehicle speeds, ranging from 60 to 360 kilometers per hour. So now we're getting at aircraft speeds on takeoff, right? Or 360 kilometers per hour. This is a set of brown-headed cowbirds watching one of these vehicles come at them. So, we record that, we score it very carefully. And now I also wanted to point out that when you're measuring bird reactions to vehicles, you can do so in terms of distance or time. So if we're measuring the bird reaction to a vehicle in terms of distance, we call that the flight initiation distance, FID. That's the distance between the vehicle and the bird when the bird first initiates that avoidance response. But we can also measure that in terms of time to collision flight. We measure that in terms of seconds. So that's the amount of time that the bird has before the vehicle gets there when it first initiates that behavior. And so that's important here. So here on that y-axis, it's flight initiation distance. That's the measure of distance in meters. And on the x-axis there, that horizontal axis, that's those 8 vehicle speeds. So what this is telling us is that the flight initiation distance, the distance between the vehicle and the bird when it first started to move out of the way, it did not change across those different vehicle speeds. It did not matter whether the vehicle was coming at the bird at 60 kilometers per hour or 360 kilometers per hour. The birds always tended to take off when the vehicle was about 28 meters away, right? That's pretty remarkable. And it becomes important for safety when you look at that in terms of time. So now the x-axis is the same, but I've changed the y-axis to time to collision, that time variable. So here, when the vehicle was coming at 60 kilometers per hour, all the way there on the left, the bird had plenty of time to spare, right? It had about 2 seconds before the vehicle hit it when it first took off. But as the vehicles keep getting faster, it had very little time to clear the path of the vehicle once it started that avoidance response. Now, it turns out for these birds, it takes about 0.8 seconds to clear the path of the vehicle once it starts that avoidance maneuver. And that's what that dashed line is. So once you get past 120 kilometers per hour, it didn't have time to clear the path of the vehicle once it started that avoidance response. Now, this is remarkable. What this is saying is that even if a bird can see the vehicle coming, there's no problem with distraction, no problem with seeing the vehicle. Even if it can see it coming the entire way, there's something hardwired in that bird's brain that won't let it get out of the way in time when the vehicle exceeds a certain speed. And we have not just seen that for brown-headed cowbirds, we've seen it for other species as well. We've seen it for white-tailed deer. And we've actually seen this in the field, not just in the video lab. So we think we've identified a pretty major factor that leads to bird collisions and all kinds of vehicle collisions, actually. So one of the primary results from what we're calling the speed kill study here, cowbirds usually responded quickly enough to avoid these low-speed collisions, but they were overwhelmed by the high-speed ones. They appeared to use this spatial rule, and we can talk about this later if one of you find me in the hallway. This is probably an anti-predator behavior. Terry mentioned this. This is leftover anti-predator behavior that they're trying to use for vehicle avoidance. It's just maladaptive. It's not working. And at high vehicle speeds, the lack of adjustment in flight initiation distance resulted in little time for avoidance at the onset of these escape responses. All right, so we've got problems with habituation, we've got problems with vehicle speed, and we've got problems with these perceptual errors birds are making, right, in response to these vehicles. So all that can lead to collision. Now, I don't mean to imply we have everything figured out. There's lots of other problems, lots of other reasons birds collide with helicopters and other aircraft. But these are some of the things we've identified, we believe, that lead to some of these collisions. Okay, so what are we doing about it? Well, we have done research over the years to try to look at tools and techniques to mitigate some of these strikes. I don't have a whole lot of time to go into this, but I will talk about a couple of these. Let me go back here. We've done research over the years. I've put these into a couple categories here. The first is habitat use and foraging strategies of hazardous wildlife, developing methods and tools to reduce wildlife presence as well as their food, water, and cover attractants. Now this third one, research in basic wildlife ecology, to develop non-lethal control methods. That's going to be the next presentation that Dr. Blackwell is going to tell you about, so I'm not going to go into that. But I will give you one example study from those first two real quick. The first one, alternate land covers on near airports. So the default land use at airports throughout the United States, probably as long as there have been airports in the United States, has been turf grass, right? And several years ago, we did a study where we actually quantified the amount of turf grass at airports in the United States. Turns out there's over 3,300 square kilometers. That's bigger than Rhode Island, just of turf grass at airports in the United States. So we got to wondering, is it possible, at least at some parts of airports, if there are some alternatives where we might be able to do some other things other than turf grass, and maybe some of these things might be good for wildlife hazard mitigation. So one of the ones that's become really popular over the past several years has been solar fields, solar photovoltaic installations. I just picked up my wife at Indianapolis Airport a couple weeks ago. Indianapolis Airport's got solar everywhere now. It's really impressive. And to the FAA's credit, they saw this coming. And back in 2010, they actually put out guidance that told airports how they could go about putting solar installations on their airfields. But there was nothing in this guidance about potential wildlife hazards. Now, this is important because there is potential for photovoltaic arrays to increase wildlife hazards because two things that photovoltaic arrays could provide birds are perches and shade, because there aren't many perches or shade at airports. So we put together a study where we looked at bird use of paired airfield grasslands and photovoltaic arrays at 5 sites in 3 states and looked to see how they compared. And to go straight to the results, turns out it's a wash. The y-axis there, our response variable, was a cumulative measure of bird hazard. I don't have time to tell you how we calculated that, but if you look at it, in the fall and the spring, it was about the same between airfield grasslands and these solar arrays. A little bit higher in photovoltaic solar arrays in the summer, a little bit lower in the winter, but over the year, it was about a wash. So overall, we concluded that there was not an increase in wildlife hazards by installing these photovoltaic solar arrays at airports. Second category here, developing methods and tools. The one I want to talk about here is the AHD, the acoustic hailing device. This was proposed to us as a possible way to disperse birds on and around airports. This is also called an LRAD, a long-range acoustic device. This is just a big, powerful speaker that projects sounds in a very narrow beam. It was developed for long-range communication and non-lethal crowd control. We had no idea whether this might work to disperse birds. So we evaluated it as a potential dispersal tool for free-ranging birds that are recognized as hazardous. The basic design here was bird counts before and after treatment with the acoustic hailing device. And again, to go straight to the results, turns out it works really well for some species like vultures and gulls. It turns out it doesn't work hardly at all for other species like blackbirds, ducks, and coots. Don't know why. That would take some further research. But our conclusions here was that it's unlikely to be useful across a wide range of applications, but potentially could be effective targeting certain species. So what's next for us on our research agenda? Well, right now we're evaluating mallard duck responses to vehicles during day and night. We know almost nothing about how birds react to vehicles at night. And that's important because there are very many, actually, very dangerous strikes with birds at night, especially during migration. I've dealt with several of those incidents, actually, including with helicopters. So this is something we need to know more about. And we're also working to develop new strike risk metrics for wildlife hazard mitigation. If you only have so much money to put toward this, where is it best to put your money? So we're trying to figure that out right now. Okay, so this is how you can get a hold of me and Brad. If you're interested in any of this research, you can go to devaultlab.com if you want to see these publications listed. And if you Google NWRC Research Gateway, just about all these publications are listed if you want to find them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Brad Blackwell, who will tell you specifically about the research he has led over the years into aircraft lighting and how that might be able to be used to increase aircraft avoidance by birds.
Yeah, that one we can see right there. If you want to go slide by slide, that's fine.
Let's do that. Let's do that. So I apologize for that. It was supposed to be on. So anyway, let's get into this. I appreciate this time and the invitation. And you've heard from Travis. He's a co-author on this presentation as well. I want to introduce Ryan Loon. He's our PhD candidate at Purdue University. Ryan's been coming in here in the last couple of years and tackling some of the research that was left off from our team. And Travis and I have worked together for a long time with Esteban Fernandez-Urisic at Purdue University as well. So with that, let me go to the approach for my talk. Pardon the cursor if you're seeing that. So things just aren't working as well as I want them to. So a little bit about managing strikes and where strikes are occurring. Then I'd like to speak about where aircraft lighting comes into play. What the early work told us, a lot of anecdotal information, but then look at some evidence that supports lighting cues on aircraft as cues to birds, and then an application. So really quickly, when we're managing wildlife at airports, we're looking basically at the Part 130 within the United States, the Part 139 certificated airports on the top graph. This is coming from the FAA's annual report. And then on the bottom graph, the general aviation airports. Now, the green are strikes that have occurred at or below 1,500 feet AGL, and the blue are strikes above 1,500 feet AGL. Now, the timeline is on the x-axis is from 2000 to 2021. So what we see is a situation where we have commercial transport aircraft are basically showing no increases over the time in this period in strikes at the low altitudes. And the reason is at Part 139 airports, we're having generally a wildlife management program in place. And so there's biologists in the field doing a lot of things that Travis just talked about. At altitude, however, we're seeing an increase, a significant increase in strikes over this time period. As these aircraft leave the airport environment and the near airport environment, they're going through a bird-rich zone up to around 3,000 to 3,500 feet AGL. So, and they're going fast and they're big and there's lots of them moving, lots of aircraft movement. So we're striking more birds, and the wildlife management on the airport does not touch that area. If you move down to the bottom graph, you see a significant increase in strikes at general aviation airports at or below 1,500 feet. Very few of these airports have wildlife management programs in place. The flat line for the at altitude strikes is a composite of many variables. Here we have fewer large and fast moving aircraft transitioning that bird rich zone, although these smaller aircraft are flying around in it. There's also a difference in reporting. There's a difference in speed. But generally what we're seeing here is that we don't have wildlife management in place. So overall, between the two airport types, we're seeing an increase in strikes. So the question comes up then, can we supplement the effects of wildlife management on the ground at altitude? And for 50 years, people have been talking about trying to make aircraft more visible to birds. And much of this discussion has been anecdotal. In 1999, however, we started thinking about lighting. We started thinking about lighting primarily because we weren't protecting aircraft, but also we had the good fortune of a contact from private industry in Bend, Oregon, Precise Flight Incorporated, and they build the Pulse Light device. And many of you likely have this device on your aircraft. It allows you to pulse your landing lights and other lights on your aircraft. It doesn't do anything to the spectral composition of the light. It just allows you to pulse it up to around 2 hertz, I think is the legal limit. Well, Precise Flight has seen a decrease in strike rates for their customers in the Pacific Northwest simply by pulsing their landing lights. And they asked us if we knew anything about it. So we designed a study that tried to get at this, very similar to some of the slides Travis showed you, looking at vehicle approach using aircraft lighting on the vehicle and pulsed, non-pulsed, and also control run without lighting. And what we showed that there was something to this. We could get the birds' attention. We could make them move more quickly. It wasn't consistent. Something was still missing. And a lot of this had to do with our early experimental designs, but it gave us a little bit of a boost towards this question. We went on then to partner with Precise Flight again, and they, with their customer Qantas, developed a field evaluation over a 2-year period, looking at the effects of strikes on fleets of Qantas aircraft that had the pulse light system operating on their landing light versus the same aircraft that didn't. And what they found is that for their 737-400 fleet, they had a significant drop in strike rates and a savings of over $1 million per year. For their 737-800 fleet, they saw a 24% drop in strikes with over $3 million savings. Now, again, this wasn't a tight, objective scientific study. This was anecdotal, but it really gave the company something to work on whether they wanted to buy that product. And again, this is early days. These were incandescent lights. We knew nothing about what the birds could actually see. We just knew that we had a pulse in there and something was going on. So the premise behind this is that when you're flying, when you're flying, we want that bird that's in your way to see you. It's a big, novel object coming at it fairly fast. We want to get their attention. We want to concentrate visual attention to that bird, which means some way, somehow, we have to figure out how to visually communicate with that bird. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We want that bird to begin an escape response and hopefully avoid your aircraft But if it struck it in a less damaging area, so, in your case, windscreens or perhaps an engine ingestion, we don't want that to happen. So how do we do that? Well, we began thinking about this a little bit more, and lo and behold, Flight 1549 was forced to ditch in the Hudson River in January. They had climbed through a flock of migratory Canada geese at about 2,800 feet AGL, if I recall. Well, through the hearings with the NTSB had a piece of research from our lab here, and they charged the FAA and the USDA to start pursuing in earnest the aircraft lighting question. They used pulse lights here again, because at the time, that was the only thing going, was pulsing these lights. They knew nothing about spectral composition effects on birds, and that's where we jumped in. This is a paper that they had in their hands during those hearings. We just finished it in 2009, published it. This is one of examples of our research involving vehicle approach and aircraft lighting. This time we started to tease apart some of the visual physiology and looking at the effects of ambient light relative to the light we had and the pulse rate of that light. So ironically, that was done right before the 1549 had their incident. But afterwards, we jumped right on some research, and this is somewhat cart before the horse type research. We had now more technical abilities to dig into the visual physiology of species, but because of this incident, we wanted to get a piece of research out quickly that would inform the FAA. So we, for the very first time, flew an aircraft at birds. You can see the birds, these Canada geese, were in a pen area. We had cameras everywhere. This is a radio controlled aircraft. This is pre-drone era, but it was quite a large aircraft. And on this aircraft, we had white full spectrum LEDs that pulsed at 2 hertz. Our treatments involved the pulsing treatment or a no light treatment. We also had another radio controlled aircraft that looked very much like a large Raptor, and we paired the behavior of the birds in response to that against this civil airframe, and it was quite similar. But the take-home part of this study, which was published in 2012, is that we were able to get the attention of these geese 4 seconds earlier. And that meant they detected the aircraft sooner with lights on, and they started to respond sooner. They also moved sooner. Now, they couldn't fly. We couldn't have birds in this open cage that could fly and escape, but they were able to form a group and move at a significantly earlier time. This is really encouraging for us, because at the same time, I said cart before the horse, we had the physiology coming into play that was also published with this. And we, for the first time, dug into the visual ecology of Canada geese. And that has been our focus since then. This is the paper that came out. We can make that available to you as well. It's an old paper, it's 2012, but this was really a foundational piece of work. But it got us to start thinking about, how do we do this experiment? And we decided, our series of experiments, well, we decided to start with the retina, the bird's retina, and work from the visual capabilities toward the design of behavioral experiments, some of these involving vehicle approach and lighting, others just lighting, and hopefully feed that information back into the engineering of lighting systems. That's been our goal for some time now. So why do we want to do this? This is a busy slide, and I'm going to walk you through it. But birds see their world so much differently than we do. If you move to the top left of the slide, birds have wide lateral vision. This is a European starling, so they can see just about all the way around their head. We have frontal vision, of course. Moving to the right, the birds also have high visual acuity. They can see 2 objects as 2 objects at distance, more so than humans can. So the ability to discern those 2 objects is, and the physiology there allows us to estimate that distance as well. We'll see a little bit more of that shortly. They have more visual pigments than we do, so they can see colors that we can't imagine. They also have within their cone cells, which are the chromatic component of vision, they have little oil droplets, these organelles that help them fine tune the amount of light that gets us to the business end of the retina, or the pigment epithelium, where the processing takes place before it goes to the brain. Now, moving to the bottom of the slide, you see a person, and they have a bank of white lights. Because birds see their world so much differently, you might have a greater rhea, which is on the right, for example, that would see the same lights as hot pink. This isn't necessarily accurate, but it's just to make the point that we cannot assume that what you see and what I see is what those birds see. So how do we wrap our brains around this? Well, let's talk a little bit more about details. On your right of this slide, we have human vision. There's 3 peaks: the blue, the green, and the red. Again, that's how we perceive colors. So let's use the x-axis, which is the wavelength of light. And then we have that dashed line, which is your achromatic or your rod cells, so contrast. Now move over to your left, you have a generic bird visual system. So we have peaks in the violet. Some birds will peak in the UV as well. The blue, the green, and the red, and then that achromatic component for the rod cells. And you can see the span across the wavelengths of light on the x-axis. Now, what's cool about birds is they do something we can't do. They can take that short wavelength light, that violet signal, and they can pair it with that red signal inside the retina, process that, and in the brain see colors that you and I can't imagine. So it makes it a little bit more difficult on how to turn this into an engineering formula, but we're getting there. We're going to talk a little bit how to do that. So this slide comes from Ryan Loon's PhD work. On your left, at the top, we have the Canada Goose ocular media. That's the tissue of the eye, and you can see on the x-axis the wavelengths of light that actually move through that tissue without being absorbed or blocked. Then you have in the middle there a Canada Goose visual pigments. So what I just showed you, so the peaks of the visual pigments for the Canada Goose visual system. And then the adjustment to the right caused by the oil droplets, fine-tuning that adjustment that gets to the pigment epithelium. There in the middle, we have the Canada Goose sensitivity curves. These are the wavelengths that the bird can see. They actually get to the processing of the retina. Now, how do we use that? Now, if you move to the top of your slide, you see the Canada Goose photoreceptor relative densities. That we need to ask within the retina, what cells are given over to, say, foraging or to mate selection, or which cells are given over to noticing objects coming at the bird, whether it be at another bird or a vehicle. Those are the cells we want to target. And in that column, that histogram there, you see a brown cell, the double cone. We're not going to talk about that today. It's fairly complicated. It does have a role, but today we're going to stick with the colors. So now we know if we go to where the portions of the retina given to object detection and the peaks of those particular wavelengths, now we can move to the marketplace and say, okay, what LEDs are manufactured that pair well with this visual system? And that's what Ryan has done. And that leads us to the bottom graph where he's got an experiment involving a 484 nanometer LED and a 628 nanometer LED. So the Canada Goose can see both these colors. Now we need to ask the question, what do they do with it? But before we do that, just real quick, a summary. So on your left, we have the visual configuration of an avian eye. So what the bird can see around it as far as its head, and then the actual components of the cellular structure of the retina itself. This leads us into developing the research. And you can see this tetrahedral here is the visual space of the bird. It has the short wavelength, the long wavelength, the middle wavelength, and the UV or violet system. Your aircraft is that green dot. That brown dot is the background lighting. We want that green dot as far away from the background lighting as possible. We want you to stand out depending upon, no matter what the background ambient conditions are. So that type of thought process and that processing in a bird would then go to the brain, which is a black box for us right now, but it spits out behavior. How do we capture that? We designed experiments where it involves lighting or vehicle approach, as shown here on the right. Now, I mentioned we don't always use vehicles. In 2018, Benny Goller and the rest of us published a gave birds a choice. That brown-headed cowbird that Travis showed you was the subject of this experiment. The birds could see the lights that we gave them. We gave them a UV light because brown-headed cowbirds are UV sensitive. We gave them a white full spectrum light. We gave them a green and one in the blue and one in the red. They were indifferent to most of these lights, except for the blue and the red, which they avoided, but they avoided the blue most. Now, the question we have to ask too is if you could see a light, we don't want to put a light on an aircraft that they're indifferent to. We don't want to put a light on your aircraft that they're attracted to. We want them to avoid it. So this was a telling piece of information for us. It also was a way to save a little research money because we didn't throw a vehicle into this experiment yet. But Ryan, our graduate student, did scale that experiment up to include Canada geese and ask the same questions. And what we found is Canada geese avoided the 471 nanometer blue light more than the red lights. More telling is that Ryan, in digging through the data a little bit more, found that over time, individuals repeatedly exposed to the red light started to become attracted to the red light. That's not a good thing for aircraft. So Ryan is working on these data right now, and this is a forthcoming paper. So where are we? We know that we can estimate detection because of visual acuity for an opaque object, but we have never done this for a point source of light. Now we're getting into the engineering here that goes into light design for people. We're asking the same questions. We know, for example, at distance that light intensity dissipates. This is the inverse square law. So the energy twice as far from that point source, which is your aircraft, to spread over 4 times the amount of area, and therefore you have 1/4 the intensity. So when that intensity is a key feature of detection of the aircraft for people. Now, the experiments that go into the engineering component for people is you can ask the subject, can you see the light relative to a contrast? With a bird, you can't do that clearly. So we have to design the experiment a little bit differently. And that's what we're doing right now. And Ryan's in the midst of this. And so the questions we have, or the things that we're working on, is we know species visual acuity for the Canada goose. We know the quantum catch of the eye. These are the photons at particular wavelengths that eye catches, those cells capture and then process in the retina. Where we are now is providing the math for the simple contrast model, or a contrast sensitivity function. That is the point where that aircraft can no longer be detected against the background lighting. This is the same sensitivity function they use for people, except now we've inserted a Canada goose, and we had to tweak the math a little bit. Now we're asking questions too about how background can change that sensitivity function, that point where that aircraft is, that the intensity is the same and it cannot be discerned. That's a critical distance for us in detecting an aircraft. But how does background dust, ambient light conditions, other light come in and affect that detection? And we have the equations set up for this, and Ryan's working through them right now. So this is going to get us to, from the point of wavelength that the birds can see, wavelength that is useful for object detection, to actually getting to a detection of a large approaching object at speed coming at the bird, and hopefully initiating that avoidance response. Our work's going to be finished over the next year and culminate in a final report to the FAA. We've done this for one final report in 18 already. This will be one that will go into, I hope, a call for proposals to industry to build the first aircraft light that is intended to enhance detection and avoidance responses by birds. So if I have time, I'll take questions. If not, hopefully this evening. So thank you for your time.
Well, a round of applause, please. Brad, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate that. Do we have any pressing questions that we'd like to ask on this? Yes, sir. The question from the audience was the value of wildlife reports
To the FAA.
to researchers, the FAA accordingly.
Of course, over 21, 22 years now, the reporting rates have increased, particularly after Flight 1549. But those data that you report for your strikes, they populate a database. It's now not just a record of strikes. We're turning, with the FAA, we're working to turn that database into an active or proactive tool where we can get, where your comments, for example, might show us a little bit about the behavior of the bird before you struck it, or before you missed it, if you saw it in the airport environment. So they're critical. You can't do strike risk. Strike risk is a component of the likelihood of the collision and the likelihood of damage. The math is still being worked out, and Travis and I are working on that. But you can't do risk until you have the reports. So please keep reporting.
So SNARG collection, again, the term is new to me. So SNARG collection, I'm sure you'll know what that is for species identification.
Yeah, very important. If we don't have, birds don't see the same across species. So it's important to know who we're hitting. And obviously at a specific airport, because of the management in place, we want to know what the relative risk is across species. So unless you report all the data, including what you saw, what you hit, and have the SNARG, then we're not going to be able to discern the species ranking relative to risk. So it's not all the same from starlings to Canada geese to robins to warblers. We need to have that those data to differentiate or strike risk, and that's going to change across the airports. And as Travis noted too with his talk, we may not be talking about eliminating strikes if we could just, with the lighting, for example. I mean, if we're going to overcome a bird with speed, which is fairly indicative from our work, can the lighting make it move sooner? Now, I would rather, in some of these cases, striking a warbler is not as serious as striking a Canada goose or a vulture. So it's important for us to know what you're hitting. So.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
All right, folks, we're going to keep moving on. Brad, thank you for your time.
Thank
Really
you. Appreciate
the presentation. Travis, Terry, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. We're going to keep moving on in theory. We're going from the birds seeing us to us seeing things. And so we're going to work into the next phase, which is sharing the air with drones. I'd like to invite John Meehan up from the FAA to have this discussion. Again, this is that same discussion. It's that same issue that's in development. And I think it's worthy of a talk. We have had drone strikes. It has occurred. And he's going to bring you some data points to that and show you where it's at and so forth. So please.
Thank you, Randy.
Yes, sir.
So I want to comment on the SNARS report because we've had a lot of reports come in that, hey, we just had a drone strike. And one of the first things we try to tell our FSDOs is go out and collect that, take a swab of the supposed area. And we found that in many times it proves that it was a bird strike. But the SNARS report is very important. So if you do have what you think is a collision with a drone or a bird, please do ask the people who show up there to actually take a swab of the area, and because it's very, very useful for the FAA investigations. So I'm going to talk to you. I found it very interesting. I'm a former Army helicopter pilot. I was an instructor pilot down at Mother Rucker many years ago. I was an OH-58 Alpha and Charlie model person and a UH-1 person. And I also have a Part 107 remote pilot certificate. And I spend a lot of my time doing outreach with the FAA safety team, primarily to the drone community. And we've noticed in my team, something very interesting that we wanted to share with you, the helicopter community, because it's very important to us as the helicopter pilots to understand that drones, in fact, really do pose a risk to helicopters. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I spend a great deal of my time talking to the drone community, helping them understand that, yes, in fact, drones do pose risk to other aircraft. And so this is how you can get in touch with me, my contact information, and I'll be around afterwards if you want to continue the conversation. Since most of you, those of you who are online, most of my audience is to my left, and I'm gonna use my laser pointer on the screen. So I'm gonna focus more on this side, if you don't mind, folks over there. But I'll try to weave back and forth. But many people don't quite yet know that there have been 7 confirmed collisions between drones and helicopters in the United States. 7. There's been 2 probable collisions between drones and GA fixed-wing aircraft. Those occurred in traffic patterns, and the NTSB determined that those were probable collisions. Interestingly enough, 3 of the 7 collisions occurred below 400 feet above the ground. And this is quite a shock to the drone community, not to us. And then I've got a picture at the end of my presentation of a Chilean Navy Jet Ranger, which looks awfully similar to the one I used to fly, where it has a hole in the windscreen, and it's quite an attention getter. And that was a collision with a 20-ounce drone, a Mavic 2, and it went through the windscreen and severely injured the mechanic who was sitting in the left seat, hit him in the face, cut him, and they had to do an emergency landing and diversion over to a hospital, and real attention getter. So here's a real scenario that this really happened. This is a near midair collision that was reported down near El Paso, Texas, last April. And this is the report that comes in to the FSDO from the air traffic control. So it was an EMS flight repositioning from a local hospital over to El Paso airport, and was he reported a near midair, and the air traffic controller took the information. And then this is the report that comes in, and you'll notice on the report it says 4,500 feet. That's an MSL, and the actual altitude was approximately 300 feet AGL. And it was at early in the morning. The sun was rising. He's generally flying into the sun, and this was the report that came in. 9:45, 86 degrees, density altitude, right? Density altitude plays a factor in here. Visibility, it's clear skies, visibility unlimited, what we call a CAVU day, beautiful day. But because of the temperature and the altitude, pressure altitude, he is power limited, and he wasn't able to really yank in the collective and get moving down the road. And he also, the airport was nearby, and he wanted to remain out of the way of fixed wing traffic, so he elected to stay relatively low. Now, the drone that was involved is a DJI Mini 2. It's about the size of a Blue Jay. If the Blue Jay's got its wings spread, and this is an important thing I want you to kind of think about, and this is a typical drone that's out there flying. And by the way, in about 80 years of manned aviation, we have had about 300,000 registrations of manned aircraft. And in less than 5 years in the drone community, we have over 800,000 drones that are registered. And those are the ones that are registered, right? Not including the ones that are not registered. And recreational flyers can have more than one drone count as one registration. The drone in question weighed about a half a pound, and it was about 11 inches across. So basically, think about like a Blue Jay when it's got its wings fully expanded. It's about the size of a Blue Jay, right? And the scenario was that a construction company was doing some work at a local high school tennis courts. They wanted some aerial photos of it, so they hired a rented drone pilot. And he came over, parked the car at the closest intersection to where the location was, and started his operation, and he did it solo. Now, these pictures are not in scale, but we got some amazing data from a company down there. But and obviously, the two aircraft are not in scale, but this is essentially where the near midair occurred, and the drone is much bigger in the picture than it is in real life. But notice something here, right? The helicopter is going at 272 feet AGL, and he's just barely climbing 64 feet a minute and going about 82 knots. The drone is higher than the helicopter. He's at 371 feet, and he's totally legit to be there. He's in Class G airspace. He's under 400 feet. He's got, he's complying with the weather, so he's allowed to be in that vicinity. Now, what's interesting is this is the location. You can see the intersection here, and this is the location where the drone pilot was. He parked his car right here, and his subject area was here. He was taking video and still pictures. And the helicopter, and I'll show you on another slide here, but the helicopter is basically moving in this direction. That's a local high school. It's a 5-story building. There's a football field. And I want you to look at this area when I show some more pictures here. But this is a escarpment, about 100 foot tall escarpment that there's no possible way, you'll see here in the next slide, or in a future slide, but there was no possible way that the drone pilot could see the actual location from where he was standing. And so here's Google Earth. There's the location of the hospital where the helicopter took off. And this is an approximation of the flight path. He meandered a little bit getting over there, but basically flew over the football field. And where the X is the approximate location of the near midair. And again, it's Class G airspace. Here's the VFR sectional. And I want you to notice a couple things about this VFR sectional. So he's in Class G. And you see this tower here, 4,182 feet, 475 feet AGL. Now, the helicopter community, I've been reminded by some of my colleagues to say, hey, you need to remind the helicopter community that according to 107.51, that a drone could be 400 feet above that and be legal. So my brothers and sisters in the helicopter community fly at least 400 feet above those towers, right? And you'll avoid most of them. But a drone pilot could be legal at 875 feet within 400 feet of that structure. So they are allowed to go 400 feet above as long as they stay within 400 feet laterally of that structure. And they are totally legal in Class G. Now, I love these photos, and I apologize. I stitched them together from Google Earth. So this is the street, and it continues on. But this is where the drone pilot basically stood to do the mission. Here's the escarpment I was talking about. So the subject of his photography was this area up in here. And This is the high school. It's a five-story building, and the helicopter, basically, the route of flight is basically like right along here at 271 feet AGL, right? And then what I was just talking to a bunch of drone pilots. I said, notice this hill up here, and I try to reemphasize to them that site selection matters when you're doing your drone operation. And had the drone pilot picked this spot to either locate himself or some visual observers, he would have had a completely unobstructed view of the entire city. And it was right there, right? Just so close. But part of my message to you all is these are new aviators in general. And I know I'm very, gross generalization here, but many people flying drones are not trained the way we are about risk management, or not trained about aeronautical decision making. They don't have the experience that we do. Many of them understand ground risk, particularly the public safety folks. They know about ground risk, but they really don't understand aviation risk, air risk. They really don't understand speed, relative speed, and ground speed. What else do I want to tell you about this? I think that's it for this slide. Now, this is very interesting, and again, this is data that we captured from the drone itself, the telemetry of the drone, and I know it's a busy slide here, but and again, what I'm trying to do is help you understand how the drone pilot is thinking, how they're operating, so that maybe you can think about doing things differently in your operation. But I want you to notice a few things about this. So this yellow line traces the flight of the drone. And up here, you can see that the drone flew for about 14 minutes and 35 seconds. In that time, his battery's already down below 43%. So he's got another 10 minutes or so of flight time before the drone's going to land itself. That's the MSL altitude. This is the distance above the ground at this point in time, and it's about 355 feet away from him, going at 16.8 miles an hour laterally, 0 vertically. But so he takes off from here, the drone comes up, comes around, takes some pictures, comes around, goes all the way over to the other intersection. And by the way, the distance between the hospital and this location was about a half a mile. Comes back around, and this is all within 14 minutes and 35 seconds, right? So, solo pilot doing a photo mission. What do you think the reality is about them looking at the airspace versus looking at the screen of their controller? Right? I think we could pretty much conclude that this person was not looking at the airspace. They were probably what I would call a distracted pilot flying, looking at his controller. He's not looking in the sky, more than likely. Now, remember my Blue Jays. So this blue line here is a division. These are the same two images, just one's the side to the right is relative, just smaller. But here's the Blue Jay. That's the same. That's the relative size of the drone. So that's how big that drone is compared to a Blue Jay. Okay, weighs a half a pound. Now, think about this. Think about a gray-colored drone or a white-colored drone on a cloudy day or a gray day. I remember from my Aero Scout training, background matters on identifying a target, right? So think about the visibility of a gray-colored drone or a white-colored drone when the background is gray or white. You're going to have even less of a chance, in John's opinion, to see this, right? And how likely, when you're going 100 knots, and 100 knots is on the slow side nowadays, how much time are you going to have before you realize that that little speck in your windscreen there is actually a drone and not going to dive out of the way? Now, I want you to think about something else, a little audience participation here. The drone pilot is operating, let's say that you're the drone pilot, and from where you're seated, let's pretend, and for the audience online, we've got a little chandelier here that's made of some LEDs, the really green, beautiful colors. But let's pretend that your drone is one of these green lights from where you're sitting. Now, you're the drone pilot, with your ground controller, operating your drone from where you sit, and that's your drone. And let's just say the helicopter or the ultralight is approaching from this exit sign. Let's talk about visual illusions and relative angle. From where you're sitting, how do you know the angle if the helicopter coming from the exit sign heading towards your drone is a collision hazard with unaided vision? How do you do that? Right? You can't do it, right? Because we know from visual illusions, relative position, relative motion, your eyeballs are not located where the other aircraft, where your aircraft is, right? So this is and the drone community doesn't quite get that yet. Now, there's an advisory circular that the FAA did many, many years ago. I think it's advisory 61-93. It's a collision avoidance for pilots. And in that advisory circular, it mentions that the FAA had conducted some research and found that on average, it takes the average pilot, and I'm going to paraphrase it, or the average undistracted pilot, it takes them 12.5 seconds, takes him or her 12.5 seconds to detect another aircraft, decide what to do, and then act upon it, right? And we all know that the fundamental concept or the foundational concept of the National Airspace System is see and avoid, right? That if our radios fail, if our lights fail, if air traffic control fails, if everything fails, it all boils down to we have to see each other and avoid each other, right? And so studies show that it takes 12.5 seconds for an undistracted pilot to do this, right? And in a helicopter going 100 knots ground speed at 186 feet a second, 12.5 seconds is a half a mile. Now, this is part of what we're trying to communicate to the drone community is, hey, you better be able to see down to the horizon at least a half a mile in every direction in order to be safe. But these three pictures are typical operating environments of these drone operations, particularly public safety. If you've got colleagues who are in public safety, I'll bet you a beverage of our choice that this is where they operate, and think about how fast that helicopter comes blowing over this field and how many seconds of reaction time that person has, even if they're looking up. How many more seconds of reaction time will the drone pilot have if they're not looking up and in fact they're focused on their screen, or what I call screen watching, right? It increases that time even more dramatically. And how close will you be to them by the time they figure this out? Too close. So hopefully you see where I'm going with this. So some of the messages for the helicopter community is, again, right, when we talk about small drones, we're talking about a drone that weighs less than 55 pounds. There are drones that are out there that are 55 pounds or more. And I already talked about the registrations and the sheer numbers of them. I want you to understand that regulations prohibit drones from using ADS-B out. And this is done for a number of reasons. There are some exceptions. The Department of Interior has an exception. But drones will not be using ADS-B out. So you're not going to be able to pick them up using ADS-B in. And some of them are trying to use ADS-B in order to detect you. And so, and I try to remind them that ADS-B is a wonderful system, but it's a line of sight system, and it also is not 100% reliable below 2,500 feet. And they're also going to be picking up the airliner going at 37,000 feet across their airspace. So what's it really doing for them? The other thing you need to know is that drone pilots are not allowed to be using a radio, and that's an FCC requirement because that's aviation spectrum. FCC regulates aviation spectrum, and they do not want drone pilots talking on the radio. You can get it. It's a ground station license. It's a FCC Form 605, Charlie. It's the same one I used to get when I was running an FBO. They won't issue them because they don't want drone pilots talking on aviation spectrum. So, and many of them don't know what frequency to monitor of you anyway, and they're not monitoring those frequencies. So don't assume you're going to be able to talk to them. big point I want you to know is that the drones today do not have detect and avoid systems. The detect and avoid system is what I just demonstrated to you. It's the M1A eyeball. That is the detect and avoid system. And hopefully our little experiment here showed the limitations of that. And again, drones are allowed to fly above 400 feet legally. So that they are allowed to do that. And there's the regulation if you want to go look it up. Now, drones are required to get out of your way. They are. It is there's no discussion, but the reality is on the other side of the screen, right? That when I talk to drone pilots, many of them are just completely shocked when I inform them that, oh no, you don't own the airspace below 500 feet. They really think that they're safe and there's no other conflicting aircraft under 500 feet. So that's an educational challenge. For sure, in every one of these cases, in 100% of those collisions and in this near midair, where we were able to find the drone pilot, 100% of all of those drone pilots admitted that they were heads down screen watching. They also said they were totally shocked at how fast that helicopter came upon their position. They all thought, oh, I'm going to hear it. I'm going to have plenty of time to get out of the way. And we all know, I know this community knows that acoustics, wind, environmental factors, road noise, you're not going to be able to hear it and guess correctly where it's coming from. You might hear it, but you're not going to guess correctly where it's coming from. And remember, a lot of these drone pilots are operating in urban environments where there's a lot of noise. But they all think that they're going to hear you coming and have plenty of time to get out of your way. There's 100% of them. So here's kind of this is my final slide. This is the picture of the Chilean Navy helicopter. Notice, and this one really comes home to me because that's where I used to sit when I was at Fort Rucker in the OH-58s. And that this really did happen. It went right through the windscreen. That drone weighed 20 ounces. It was at 800 feet above the ground. It was at night. They never found the drone pilot. The helicopter had to make an emergency diversion, but get above 400 feet and get above 400 feet above the highest obstacle in your vicinity. That's kind of our message here. Hey, get up there as fast as you can. And I think the bird strike also reinforces that. The higher you get, the safer you're going to be. Wear eye protection. You know, if this slide doesn't get your attention, if you don't want to wear the visors, wear some shooting glasses or ballistic glasses. Now, just like there are known locations where birds hang around, many times there are known locations where drones hang around. And I would also argue that some engagement needs to happen between the helicopter community and the drone community and the media in particular. And there are certain areas where there are either drone remote control clubs flying around. Plot them on your operations map if you know where they're going to be. There's tourist attractions that tend to attract certain drones, right? So know where those are. And then the last point here is a great idea that came from, I think it was our Baton Rouge FSDO, where they were talking with a public safety entity, an EMS outfit, I believe. And I want to make you all aware that many local entities are acquiring drone detection software. And the FAA doesn't know who they are, doesn't know where they are, because they don't need permission from the FAA to acquire drone detection software. But for the helicopter community, particularly the EMS folks or the 135 folks, there are many public safety entities that are starting to acquire these systems either at airports or at law enforcement. And reach out to them, talk to them, and work out something where you can talk to them. Your dispatcher can let them know, hey, we're going to this accident scene. You got any drones in the area? They might have a mobile unit that can pick them up. Now, there's a limitation to these systems. Many of them are oriented towards one manufacturer. Most 90% of the drones are DJI products, and they'll pick up all the DJI products if they bought that system, but they won't pick up the other 10%. So it's not 100% guaranteed that there's no drones out there, but it is a suggestion. It does seem to work that the EMS outfit says, hey, we're dispatching out to this location. And in fact, the public safety entity may say, oh yeah, we got 2 drones out there right now. Okay, where are they? And then that way alert the crew before they go. So this concludes my presentation there. I hope it gave you some things to think about, and happy to answer any questions if you have.
Any questions in the house? Oh, goodness
Wow.
gracious. Look at there. Man, that's,
All right, you've already asked the Snarge question, so you got it.
that's all right. Coming from your left to right. Who's the ones over here had some questions? Let me, bear with me 1 second. There you go, sir.
Where does the recently released remote ID fit into all of this?
Yeah, great question. So remote ID is, it is not fully implemented yet. The regulation has come out. Drone manufacturers today are required to produce a drone that transmits certain data to a certain receiver, but it is in its infancy in terms of implementation. And I want you all to understand that in September of 2023, individual drone pilots are required to have a drone that has, it's like a transponder. Think about it like a transponder. They're required to have this on their system in order to operate in September of 2023. But there are some exceptions there, and that requirement is driven by the requirement to register a drone. Now, there are recreational flying drones out there that weigh under a half a pound that don't need to be registered. Therefore, remote ID is not going to apply to them. And when we have these near misses and collisions, they're usually recreational flyers. We call them the careless and the clueless that don't understand the rules, and they don't understand that there is risk. So there are some limitations to remote ID, but remote ID is going to be, I think, the fundamental building block for if we ever get to a UAS traffic management system where this will enable beyond visual line of sight operations where we can actually track the drone. It's one of the limitations today is drones don't have that detect and avoid system. Maybe this will do it externally, but remote ID is in effect. It's Part 89. If you wanted to look at it, it's 14 CFR Part 89. Manufacturers are required as of today to produce a drone that has it equipped. We did put out a message to the community that we're going to exercise our discretion in terms of enforcement of that until the end of the year to give manufacturers time to do that. So does that answer your question?
Hi, one of your first slide, it said there was 3 that were below 400 feet. The other 4, assuming, was above 400 feet.
Yes.
How high were they, and what were they doing up there that possibly caused those collisions?
The other ones, yeah. They were at very different altitudes. Yeah, there's no trend. They were all, the Chilean one, for example, was at 800 feet. I think we just had one, most recent was at 800 feet daylight. He had a Hughes, I used to call him a TH-55, hit that rotor. We had an R-44 up in Alaska. That was a $63,000 rotor blade change out. Army Blackhawk. They were all at different altitudes. There were 3 below 400 and the other 4 were above 400. And the highest, I think, was 800. The Los Angeles Police Department, I think it was 800 feet. They weren't, they were illegal.
Any additional questions on this side?
Say again? Oh, okay.
On your, I think it was your first scenario, John, in El Paso, when the helicopter just departed, were they at a cruise altitude or were they in a climb profile? I believe it was 230 feet or something on that.
Yeah,
order.
that one slide it showed him as he was climbing at 64 feet per minute, but to me he was essentially level. I think he was. What I'm told is he was power limited, and I don't know in the A-Star if it's a temp or a torque limit. But he didn't feel like he could yank the collective and get up high, and he was transitioning to a long extended crosswind, base rather, to land.
So basically, he was not really, 64 foot per minute rate of climb is almost nothing.
It's essentially,
Yeah, it's
Wow.
less than the ACS
yeah,
standard.
and he
So,
might have done cyclic when he started seeing the drone, right?
yeah, yeah. So basically he was flying, almost in a steady state altitude, setting up for a pattern to land at a
Yep.
really low altitude.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we think this is a great case study, because
Yeah.
we've all been there, right? And heck, the airport's a mile away. Come on, that's-
Thanks.
And I'll be around if you got more questions. I'll hang out at the FAA safety table. And by the way, they're gonna beat me severely if I don't remind you that if you want credit for wings, you gotta scan your QR code out there. So, yes.
So with the drone reporting in advance of operating, assuming that they actually are using the available services off the web, is that information available to traditional aviation organizations in any way to know that there are scheduled or planned drone operations in the area?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think you should assume no. If you're flying as a public aircraft drone, there's a requirement for you to file a NOTAM before you fly. But they also give them an out if officer safety is involved, and they all claim officer safety. But you can go to SkyVector and you'll see these drone NOTAMs on there. Highly unreliable, in my personal opinion. I wouldn't bank on that, and some of them are kind of ridiculous. I'm going to be from here to, Oregon, and I'll be from here to 18,000 feet. That's great. Thanks. It's the size of a Blue Jet, right? So you should assume that drones are everywhere, and that they are not going to know you're coming, and they're not going to report themselves being there. A drone pilot is not required to file a NOTAM under Part 107. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
So comment on altitudes. If any of you are familiar, there was one in Canada. I think it was a commercial aircraft on approach in, I think, Montreal. They had a drone strike at
It was
1,500
a
feet.
police drone.
1,500, and in Canada, their restriction is 100 meters instead of 400 feet.
Yeah.
So even more.
And I think that one was
Out of the
flown by
box.
public safety. That was the police department. Yeah, you should never assume that you're clear, but the rule is get out of the way. But most of these folks really don't understand it, and they're not getting out of the way in time. So get as high as you can, as quick as you can, and get that eye protection on.
We've had several encounters with apparent nuisance drones that didn't seem to be flying legitimately. Why are there no drone reports that we can file with the FAA for these?
There are certainly drone reports. If you believe there are near midair collision risks, you should file that with the local air
So
traffic.
we file it as a near midair.
Yes.
Okay. Some of them have been operating in the vicinity of a helipad. They just seem to be loitering. We're not off the ground yet, so it's not a near midair. How do we report that?
I would say file a complaint with the FSDO.
Okay.
FSDOs are required to investigate every complaint, and it has to be an aviation safety issue, right? If it's a privacy issue, somebody's spying on us, that's not an FAA issue. We don't have jurisdiction over that. That's a local law enforcement issue. But if there's an aviation safety issue, then you should report it, file a complaint. And while we're on that subject, we need, so a Part 107, person flying under Part 107 is required by the regulations to show law enforcement their photo ID, their remote pilot certificate, the plastic card that we all have, and their drone registration. They're required to show that to law enforcement. And we need that. If we don't get the drone registration, if we don't get the photo ID, if we don't get that, we get calls every day like, hey, there's a drone out there, FAA, do something. Great, thanks. You got a name? No. You got a registration number? No. Okay. Well, that's closed out, right? No action, because we don't have anything to act on. But yeah, so if you see an aviation safety issue, please do file that complaint with the local FSDO. And a near midair for sure, file that. And if you have a strike that you think was a drone strike, please do get that snarch, because we found that many of those actually turn out to be a bird. Well, thank you all for your attention. I will be around if you want to chat more about it. And my last comment is, please, we need you also to evangelize this message to the drone community. And those of you who have sister units, by the way, if you're a public safety, help them understand about aviation record keeping and aviation training. They're not quite getting it. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your help. Thank you very much.
Greatly appreciate it. Round of applause. All right, thank you all very much, and great topic. So for the virtual world, we're a little ahead of schedule, so we're going to move the schedule forward. At this point, let's go ahead and take a break. 3:15. 3:15. We're going to move the schedule ahead 15 minutes. So again, for those in the virtual world, we're going to go ahead and take a break. We're a little bit early. We're going to come back a little bit early and get this thing kicked off again and move the schedule on forward. So again, back in your seats. 3:15 for the next presentation. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get this presentation kicked off. And again, back to the virtual world. Welcome back. The folks in the room, as you can hear on the outside, to come in and take your seats accordingly. And we'll get this thing started off. Want to invite Mr. Phil Jennings back to the stage for this presentation. We're going to be talking a little bit about avoiding the flow, and specifically the title is Avoiding the Flow, Integrating Fixed Wing and Rotary Wing Aircraft. For this presentation, again, Mr. Phil Jennings from Milwaukee Regional Medical Center and Integra Aviation. Phil, it's all yours. Yes, sir.
I realize we're kind of hitting the end of the day, so I'll try and make this as informative as possible. And to do that, I'll spell out the basics of the issue, which I think is deceptively problematic, and then we'll animate the issue and the appropriate regulation with some case studies, 2 in particular. So I'm particularly interested in this because I'm a dual-rated pilot, and I'm actively flying both airplanes and helicopters. And most of my time is spent in an EC-145. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, in a King Air, and then a Citation Encore Plus, and then likely transitioning to a Gulfstream. So I go to a lot of uncontrolled airports in both airplanes and in helicopters. So I'm sort of seeing both sides of this problem and what I think is significant about it. I also think that operations in the traffic pattern it's sort of overlooked, but in addition to being overlooked, and I think this is the more important part, it's actually a problem that is, I suspect, very underreported. So for instance, there has been a lot of discussion over the years over controlled flight into terrain. I think there are 2 forms of that. One form is penetrating obstructions. So when, normally a perfectly operating aircraft collides with something on the ground, that's a controlled flight into terrain accident. Helicopter pilots are particularly interested in that. Airplane pilots generally aren't, because so much of what airplanes do is under IFR that they climb out in their way and they're routed around these things anyway. But airplane controlled flight into terrain is really a loss of situational awareness, specifically in the vertical plane. So when you look at, and Boeing has done this, when you look at CFIT accidents involving airplanes, nearly every aircraft involved in a CFIT accident, if it's in a descent, approach, and landing scenario, is lined up laterally on the final approach course. The problem is the lack of vertical situational awareness, which results in the crew descending prematurely below the glide path. And very often these occur on precision approaches where there is actually guidance to get you down. And in spite of that, people land short. And there aren't just one or two or a dozen examples. I mean, there are literally hundreds of them. And Boeing, to their credit, put together the data. So that's been very carefully studied. Moving down, loss of control is very carefully studied. It is a huge priority for the FAA, and the NTSB is particularly interested in it. We have been talking about this today. It comprises, last couple of days rather, it comprises a huge part of the accidents that the FAA focuses on. So that's a widely reported problem. Inadvertent IMC, we've talked about that. It's a very well-researched issue. People understand it. It's usually attributed to deteriorating weather, rapidly deteriorating weather, unforecast deteriorating weather, and it catches people off guard. The horizontal decision points are a very effective risk mitigation tool that we talked about this morning, but the fact of the matter is these accidents have occurred. I would just offer, I think, in the other room, kind of down around the hall, they're talking about the VTOL stuff. These issues, as I touched on yesterday, all three of these are likely to become issues as we move into a new generation of aviation operations. And so, we literally cannot take our eye off the ball. Traffic pattern deviations come into play as well, because one of the messages from the infrastructure discussion this morning regarding VTOL operations is that it's a catch-22. So the FAA, as you may know, has recently produced design standards, which are impressive in terms of what vertiports should look like. A lot of it's leveraging what has already been promulgated in terms of advisory and regulatory, in the case of public heliports, guidance in terms of the design of traditional heliports. So a lot of that's migrating into the vertiport design. However, particularly in the case of private use vertiports, the last word in how these are developed is with local municipalities, because it's a zoning issue. And most municipal zoning codes don't have a provision for vertiports. They might have a provision for airports, but they don't have it for vertiports. So all the desire for new vertiport facilities to accommodate an emerging technology may very well get hung up in local plan commissions and city councils. So the thought is that this new generation of aviation may find itself starting at airports. So if they're starting at airports, it sort of begs the question, are these new aircraft just broadly defined? And we talked about the taxonomy, and there are like 750 viable names for what's involved with a new generation of aircraft. Are they going to be airplanes, in which case the regulation, which we'll get to in a minute, applies one way. And if they're perceived as helicopters, then the regulation applies differently. And that's important. So this is an area that has sort of been overlooked, and it's wedged between these three top categories of accidents and mishaps, which have the unique advantage of being something that can very effectively be trained in a simulator. Every one of those, from control flight into terrain, loss of control, inadvertent IMC, all of that can be trained very effectively in simulators, and frankly it is for both airplane pilots and helicopter pilots. Runway incursions, on the other hand, are very difficult to train in the simulator for helicopters, because we don't really operate from the training scenario, it's really not operating in an airport environment, and sometimes the fidelity in the simulator is difficult when you're hovering, which is where you typically be operating at an airport. So it's not the perfect scenario. So the traffic pattern deviations, where are we on the map? It's kind of falling in between all of these things. And why is it important? I think it's important because it's really, really underreported. And these accidents, mishaps, not accidents, but these mishaps, near misses, whatever you want to call them, I think occur, and two pilots just kind of work it out. And that's probably good, but it's also not giving us clear data in terms of the scope of the problem. There's been a lot of discussion on traditional runway environment accidents, runway incursions. In this case, the sort of penultimate worst case scenario for aviation. It's the worst air aircraft disaster in the world involving two 747s in 1977. Most of us either remember it or are certainly aware of it just because it's so frequently talked about. So this is kind of the high watermark in terms of the problem that we're addressing. Another set of accidents just short of a collision results in a failure to hold short. So there's a runway incursion because an aircraft just sort of drifted prematurely either onto the runway they were intending to take off from, or they crossed a runway which they had been instructed to hold short of. So that's a serious problem. And there's one example in O'Hare, at O'Hare in particular, where an aircraft did a go around because of a runway incursion by a ground vehicle. They came around and had another one in just the time it took them to do a departure, come around and get lined back up. So, two runway incursions involving the same aircraft in the same 30-minute time span. So this is a very serious problem. Ground vehicles are another whole category of runway incursions. And then there's a grab bag, and I can't believe I'm standing here telling you this, but I almost hit a deer on landing in a UH-60 where we touched down at 60 knots, and literally a deer came out and on the other side of the aircraft. I never would have thought that would have occurred, but this obviously does happen in some of the outback areas. I started my career flying in UH-1s, and I quickly transitioned to UH-60s. That was 36 years ago. It's kind of amazing, but this problem is still here, and amazingly, I'm still here. I transitioned to EC-145s, then to the Bell 429. This problem still exists. I currently fly for the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center, where we have two EC-145s, huge medical center. HEMS program's been operating for 35 years. We've never had this accident, even though two of our aircraft are based at airports. My point is, in that sort of string of slides, is that this is one of those problems that just doesn't have a technological solution. We have traffic information services, we have TCAS in the airplanes. There is no technological solution. This problem really hasn't changed. So yesterday on our panel, Thomas talked about a variety of new technologies that are dealing with, various dimensions of what we focus on. It started and it still is, and it's likely to continue to be very much of a eyes out, head on a swivel sort of thing. But it's also a function of people complying with the regulation. So the FAA, of course, has given us guidance via the Aeronautical Information Manual that helps establish things. And more importantly, they provided us with a very time-tested, explicit, enduring regulation. And in the cases we'll get to in a moment, we'll see how this is frequently not complied with and how much of a problem that is. So I've tried to distill this down as much as I can. We've talked about a lot of numbers and data today, not so much in my presentation, but in others. So I'll try not to overload you. But 91.126 is the name of the game here, which just to get to the bottom line, which very succinctly establishes that unless otherwise established, which is the atypical scenario, airplanes are to make all turns to the left. Most of us know that. And helicopters have a less explicit mandate that is essentially avoid the flow of fixed wing traffic. So avoid, if you break it down, if you noted my bio on the website, I'm sort of into the legal dimension of some of this stuff, but when you break it down, avoid the flow has very specific implications, which are a little bit more nuanced than it might otherwise seem. 91.127 is the companion regulation for operations at airports in controlled airspace. So if you have Class E airspace to the ground, surface space Class E, it basically takes you back to 91.126. So we're always in this 91.126 loop, which really is two components: fixed wing avoid the left, fixed wing make left turns, and helicopters avoid the flow. So it doesn't matter where you are. Now there is an exception, of course, and it's important. I'm going the wrong direction, sorry. Controlled airports, the rules are different. just by virtue of so many things change when we get into a controlled airport environment. And for matters of efficiency, IFR operations, and just general airspace management, air traffic control can issue specific instructions to helicopters. I was down in Miami last week. I think it was at Tamiami Airport, and I noticed that the Miami Metro-Dade air operations unit is based there. And, you know, they have beautiful brand new 139s. And, you know, these guys are flying in and out of there all the time. And I suspect a lot of their operations for training and proficiency are IFR because they're recovering to an IFR airport. So, you know, that's a clear example of when they're going to fly IFR, and all of this uncontrolled airport stuff sort of is superseded by specific air traffic control instructions. And I think most of us know that. But it's important because it creates the perception that maybe airplanes and helicopters are sort of always operating in a controlled airport environment, even when they're not. And you'll see in the case studies that that becomes really problematic. So 4 unique considerations here. Caution must be exhibited when active runways are involved, and it is important that everyone understands what the taxi instructions are. So it all starts with what the taxi plan is. So in my airplane flying, we don't move the aircraft. We literally don't move out of the parking spot until we have a clear understanding between both pilots what the taxi plan is going to be. We take this very, very seriously, and I don't think we're unique. It's an explicit plan. If it's a uniquely complex plan, we may map it out on the airport diagram on ForeFlight, and we check it. So that's really important. I don't think that helicopter pilots typically do that, even though helicopter pilots are operating in an air taxi mode where they're going to fly right over the surface area of the airport. So that's number one. The second point is a communications point. There are a lot of helicopters that are based at airports, and it's very important that they're proactive. I think the helicopter pilots have the obligation to be very proactive about communicating what their plan is. Special precautions must be taken for airports that have complex arrangements. Sometimes that's articulated in controlled airspace airports with a hotspot designation, or just other indications of a specific risk or threat to operations. In any case, the airport diagram is the starting point. It's the sheet music for what we do, and it's really important. As important as it is, there's also an awareness that's important, both in terms of air traffic control's understanding of what we can do, which they usually do understand, and then pilots. And oftentimes I'll hear what I think are student pilots not really clear about what they want to do. So if they're not clear about what they want to do, then they're not going to be able to effectively articulate to air traffic control what they want to do, which creates further confusion. But the proceed as requested instruction back from air traffic control is uniquely appealing, provided the taxi and departure plan is clearly articulated in the first place. The FAA, through its air traffic control function, makes a really concerted effort to ensure that helicopters can depart and land to their area whenever possible. So that requires a certain awareness of what's going on in the airport environment. Okay. Most of you, if you're actively flying or interested in this, you're probably familiar with what we just said. But it's important as sort of foundational to see what goes wrong in the case studies. So here's the first case study. First case study involves this aircraft. This is actually a Coast Guard aircraft. It's, started out, as you may know, in the Air Force. It has a max gross weight of just short of 12,000 pounds. That's significant. 2 engines. Just a footnote, this is actually not the accident aircraft, and that's not where this is not where the accident occurred. This is actually Coast Guard Air Station in San Diego. I'm going to read the facts because I've taken the facts as provided in this lawsuit and I've distilled them down. But let me just set the stage of how this case came to be. Under the principles of sovereign immunity, it's very difficult to sue the federal government. The federal government is basically immune from a whole raft of litigation that is just not something that the federal government is going to be subject to. The Federal Tort Claims Act is one of those exceptions, and the Federal Tort Claims Act allows a private citizen to sue the federal government in cases of extreme negligence, basically for tort actions. And that's how this case was brought. So let's go through the facts. This was brought in the U.S. District Court in Oregon. So a Coast Guard HH-3 helicopter, like the one I just showed you, was operating in the traffic pattern at the Class Stop County Airport in Astoria, Oregon. This occurred in 1985, by the way. A Piper Turbo Arrow entered the traffic pattern. The pilots in each aircraft were aware of the other aircraft. That's an important fact. The HH-3 was ahead of the Piper for landing. The Piper extended his downwind to enable the HH-3 to land. Upon crossing the threshold, the Piper crashed after flying into the wake turbulence of the HH-3. And the plaintiff contends the Coast Guard crew's negligence was a substantial factor in the death of the plaintiffs. So the plaintiffs in this case are the administrators of the estate of the two pilots of the airplane who died. And they're seeking to recover damages from the federal government pursuant to the Federal Tort Claims Act. And they alleged four things. First, they alleged that the helicopter failed to avoid the flow of fixed-wing traffic. Secondly, they alleged that they failed to minimize the vortex exposure associated with the helicopter. Third, and significantly, they failed to fly a right-hand pattern. And fourth, they failed to conform its degree of care to the standards of helicopter operators by avoiding the flow of traffic and landing on the active runway. Focus on the landing on the active runway. So a trial occurs. The Department of Justice, through the U.S. Attorney's Office, has a special group of lawyers who handle these aviation-related cases. There aren't large numbers of them, but they're very specialized lawyers in negotiating through these regulatory issues and the allegations brought by plaintiffs under the Federal Tort Claims Act. This was a bench trial, so a judge made the findings of fact as opposed to a jury. And the court concluded that the negligence of the airplane pilot in failing to avoid the wake turbulence of the helicopter was the sole cause of death. Period. So it imposes, as you'll see here on the next slide, an important duty that most of us appreciate, but these pilots did not. So this is a court that a case that was brought in the U.S. District Court. That's the fact-finding court. There's an automatic right of appeal. Not everyone exercises it. In this case, the plaintiffs did. And they filed an appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which handles appeals in the Western United States, which includes Oregon. What did they say? Court of Appeals says the district court's finding of fact that the plaintiff of the airplane was responsible and that the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard pilots in particular were not, was a valid finding of fact. And there are three elements of their holdings when you distill. I mean, this is 60 pages, and you distill it down, this is what sort of pops out. And it's relevant for us today, just to get to the point. Number one, traffic flow and traffic pattern are different. So the traffic flow is intended to modulate traffic if there is traffic in the traffic pattern. The traffic pattern, upwind, crosswind, downwind, base, and final, is intended to create a predictable pathway for aircraft to negotiate their way around the traffic pattern. So flow and pattern are different. Number two, avoiding the flow is predicated on having traffic to avoid. So if an aircraft is out, and I'm not sure where Randy is, but there he is. I'm sure when you're out at uncontrolled airports at 2 o'clock in the morning doing NVG training, you're not really concerned about airplanes because there's nobody out there. So you're going to do whatever you want relative to the winds and noise abatement and fly neighborly and all the rest of it. So there are many instances, like right there, first row, where this is like not an issue. And it's one of those things, you know, it's all fun and games until someone gets their eye poked out. It's all fun and games until there's another airplane in the traffic pattern. And so we get to the third point. Flow is intended to facilitate traffic avoidance, not wake turbulence. So here's the final critical language. The airplane pilot was chargeable, so we're shifting the burden of responsibility here from the helicopter crew to the fixed wing pilot, was chargeable with knowing the dangers of wake turbulence and had the ultimate responsibility for avoiding that turbulence, which he knew was present or should have known was reasonably present on the runway, associated with an aircraft that weighs 12,000 pounds. He breached that duty by landing behind the helicopter's touch point on the runway and before the hazardous conditions of the wake turbulence had passed or dissipated. A win for the good guys, right? Because there are many airplane pilots, and I've experienced this. I've landed at an airport. This happened about 3 months ago, middle of the afternoon, nice summer day, taxied up to the self-service refuel. Next thing I know, shortly, I heard this guy on the radio. He pulls in, he's like, hey, you know, what's up with you guys using the traffic pattern? And I'm like, we use the traffic pattern all the time. And by the way, we're going to continue to use the traffic pattern. No, helicopters are not allowed in the traffic pattern. So I said, okay, would you like some insight into this? And so he and I had a little conversation, and he was very receptive and, you know, a new understanding. But I think there is a perception, incorrect one, by the way, that helicopters are basically prohibited from entering the traffic pattern. And that is a huge problem. The trial court found that the Coast Guard's conduct did not unreasonably create an unforeseeable risk to the plaintiffs. All right, so we can take from this important decision. I mean, this is a federal appellate decision, so it's the law, if you will. And I'm sure that this will provide an important precedent for other litigation, and may already have, because you've been on the books for, you know, nearly 17 years, that the traffic pattern is not the province of fixed wing aircraft. Helicopters can and will operate in the traffic pattern. Okay. Case study 2. So it's important to understand the difference between these two cases. There are many, but the one key difference is that the plaintiff in the first case brought litigation against the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act related to an aircraft that was parked on a runway. Parked on a runway. What gave rise to this cause of action was nothing that happened in the traffic pattern. It's what occurred as the airplane pilot extended their downwind as an accommodation to the Coast Guard helicopter that was on the ground. On the ground. Amazing. I can't believe the case was brought, actually. This case is interesting in another respect, in that the NTSB weighs in on this. So we're going to look at the NTSB findings and see the significance of that. This is a case, and most of what we're going to look at here is not litigation that was brought by the deceased occupants of the airplane who passed away and perished in this accident, I think pretty much immediately. But this is going to be what the NTSB concluded after their investigation, which I just point out took about 2 years for them to put together. So the NTSB, even when they have the home court advantage, this occurred in Virginia, you know, basically stands in the shadow of the NTSB headquarters, and it still took them 2 years to produce the report. So here are the facts. This case involves a single engine airplane with a student pilot and a helicopter air ambulance converging on the traffic pattern at the same time. I'll read the facts because I've distilled them down, so I don't want to miss any of the important stuff. Pilot and both crew members recalled routine radio communications as the helicopter approached the airport. So what they're saying there is that the pilot and the medical crew members in the back, which were probably a nurse and a paramedic or 2 nurses or some combination like that, they recall the communications between the pilot of their helicopter and the other pilot, the now deceased pilot. The helicopter pilot established both visual and traffic information system contact with two airplanes in the pattern, one on downwind and one on short final. So the one on short final isn't a factor. The helicopter pilot followed behind and to the north of the second airplane and continued to the west side of the airport to complete a landing at the designated helipad. During the descent, so the helicopter pilot is out of the traffic pattern. During the descent at about 500 feet, the helicopter pilot saw about 2 feet of a white wing out the right side of the aircraft. The landing skid on the right side of the helicopter contacted the wing. The wing separated from the fuselage of the aircraft, mostly because it's just held together by a couple of bolts. The aircraft crashed and both occupants perished. The helicopter, fortunately, landed safely with just minimal damage. And we'll see a picture of it. This is a PHI. Here's the airplane, lost the right wing. And you can see the damage that was done to the left wing, probably on impact to the ground, with the ground. And then the empennage and the vertical component is pretty damaged, again, probably on the landing. But it sounds as though the skid is what caused the wing to separate from the fuselage. Here's the helicopter. 43-year-old pilot. So the new concerns we have about pilot incapacitation, which is usually attributed to pilots who have a benign medical condition or possibly age and all of that goes with that. That doesn't seem to be a factor. Number two, he's a very experienced pilot, 6,800 hours. And number three, he had, not that it bears on this particular accident, but he had 427 hours of IMC time. So that's significant because most helicopter pilots don't have that much IMC time. The aircraft, however, just suffered minor damage. So EC-135 flight deck is, as you may know, fully digital. So the two versions of it, this is kind of the earlier version, and this is the later version with a full CPDS capability. It doesn't bear on this accident, but it's worth mentioning that the EC-135, like a lot of helicopters that have a full glass cockpit, now have an extended glare shield. So the S-76 has an extended glare shield. The EC-135, as illustrated here, certainly has it, as well as the EC-145. So the positive of that is it takes away the stray light that may confuse and create misinterpretation issues relative to the displays. The downside is that it may limit your view outside of the cockpit. And in this particular case, it wasn't a factor, but it's worth pointing out that it could be in another traffic pattern accident. It wasn't cited as a factor here, but it's worth noting. So the FAA, the NTSB rather, established some findings. And it's actually more revealing. The previous case, the Court of Appeal sort of laid down the law relative to the operations in and around the traffic pattern and in the airport, which is a sort of a narrow thing. But the NTSB does something more helpful for us here. And it specifically points out what went wrong. So they noted that the airplane departed about 21 minutes prior to the accident. The airplane, red flag number one, the airplane made a right downwind departure. 91-126 we saw requires airplanes to make left turns. So this guy makes a right turn, not helpful. But it's an indication of kind of what the pilot was thinking in terms of his flight discipline. Number three, we talked about the importance of being very explicit at uncontrolled airports about what a flight crew's intentions are. There were no confirmed radio position reports from the accident airplane. That's not entirely out of character for student pilots who haven't, in some cases, sort of got their sea legs as it relates to radio communications. And some people are very hesitant to make radio calls, at least in my experience, unless they're doing something very specifically related to taking off or landing. But it's announcements in and around the traffic pattern. Sometimes people are a little hesitant to make those sorts of calls. And I think that was in play here. Another factor exacerbated by the fact that they were both on the on, in effect, the helicopter side of the traffic pattern. So if you think about the left turn side of the traffic pattern as airplane territory, and you think of the right-hand side of the right turn side of the traffic pattern as helicopter territory, when you have two aircraft not operating in sequence, but they're operating sort of randomly on the same side of the traffic pattern, one properly, one improperly, the relative motion problem becomes a real problem. And that was a factor in this case. So the helicopter pilot really didn't perceive the relative motion because the airplane pilot was actually below the traffic pattern, entered the traffic pattern below the traffic pattern altitude. Okay, hit the pause. When I fly the airplane, I fly with the same pilot all the time, Part 91 Corporate Flight Department. We typically go to Class B or C, airports in Class B or C airspace, and we just follow the instructions. But we also frequently go to an airport that's in Class G, sometimes Class E airspace, depending on the weather, and we go there all the time. We have our own little procedure for how to deal with that airport. And it's a particular concern for us because two things. Number one, we always approach from the sort of opposite side of the airport where the traffic usually works. So typically people are departing to the south, but just the way it works out is kind of a southwesterly facing airport, and the winds seem to favor that, and that's kind of the preferred runway. But we're always coming in from the west. So we're kind of entering the traffic pattern, if you will, on the helicopter side of the traffic pattern, but we need to get onto the airplane side of the traffic pattern. So to mitigate the risk of all that, and the second risk is, in addition to where we're coming from, is that this is a heavy duty training airport. So there are a lot of light general aviation and sport aircraft operating in this traffic pattern. So we fly basically over the southern edge of the airport at the traffic pattern altitude. We get to traffic pattern altitude about 7 or 8 miles from the airport. We slow way down, which is sometimes hard to do in the jet with a tailwind, but we do it. And we are extraordinarily explicit about entering the traffic pattern because we're familiar with this airport. That is not the case with a lot of other airplane pilots. They just blast into the traffic pattern as they see fit at ridiculous speeds, and it creates all kinds of problems. So even though I'm sort of highlighting the errors that have had implications, the errors that airplane pilots have made that have had implications for helicopter pilots, I want to be clear that I don't think that's necessarily always the case. I think there's plenty of blame to go around and plenty of learning and improvement to go around as well. So the airplane's departure and arrival were contrary to the established guidance in 91-126. That's like right in the FAA NTSB findings. Number two, turns out that this owner of the airplane, who was also the flight instructor of the pilot of the airplane, was very clear about how to get in and get out of this airport. And finally, he gave this particular student pilot specific instructions on the solo flight in terms of how to operate in and out of the airport. And of course, turns out he didn't comply with any of it. So that's a problem. The NTSB had all of that information. By this time, the owner of the airplane was probably frustrated with the whole set of circumstances and probably came very clean. So here's the concluding slide and the NTSB's determination of probable cause. There are inherent limitations associated with see and avoid. That's fine. We have to accept those limitations and we have to work within them. And bear in mind that, you know, I sort of showed you some of the earlier aircraft that I'm familiar with, and it stands through today that there's still no technology solution to any of this. So see and avoid, limitations and all, is the thing that's going to keep us out of trouble. Number two, lack of radio communication from the airplane pilot. Okay, that's different than what I was talking about before. So the airplane pilot didn't communicate like at all, right? That's a problem. So the airplane pilot needs to be making appropriate calls, as in this case, he made his way through the traffic pattern. Have to make some calls, okay? Now, there's probably a limit in terms of how much, but more explicit calls is better than no calls at all. Third, the airplane's pilot's non-standard entry into the traffic pattern. This is a really serious problem. you know, he was 500 feet, he entered the pattern 500 feet below the traffic pattern altitude. Well, if, just like in John's presentation regarding the drones, I mean, I asked the question about at what altitude was the helicopter flying at steady state, and I think the answer is roughly 250 feet because he was close to his destination. Well, I mean, in all honesty, I don't know. I don't think the helicopters should be operating at 250 feet above the ground, unless you're taking off or landing. I mean, steady state over El Paso, Texas at 250 feet with all these penetrating obstructions. I mean, that's just like not prudent. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is, you know, we've created the stacking of for aircraft and airspace separation. So, you know, we have to be respectful. If we're telling drones they operate below 400 feet, then we need to be clear of the space that they reasonably are operating under. I realize there's an exception, but generally, people are operating below 400 feet, and we shouldn't operate where we reasonably expect them to operate. So that's a variation of this, but you can't enter the traffic pattern 500 feet below the traffic pattern altitude and expect not to have a problem, particularly when you get to the second to the last point here, you're operating on the wrong side of the traffic pattern. So this is one of those presentations, and you know, a lot of times over the years, I've gone to, you know, like most of you have gone to a lot of safety presentations, and I've sometimes walked away from it feeling like, you know, okay, what's actionable? Like, what can I do on my next flight? So today is, today's Tuesday, I think, and, or Wednesday, I guess. And I will be flying a helicopter on Friday. So this has sort of been a nice little refresher for me. I'm going to fly it after 9 o'clock. It's an uncontrolled airport. I've given this presentation, variations of this presentation, probably a dozen times, and everyone kind of walks away from it like, wow, that was a really good reminder of something that I've completely forgotten, because I spend so much time at a controlled airport. I just follow the instructions of air traffic control, which are frequently different than 91-126, which are intended to affect operations at uncontrolled airports. I get to an uncontrolled airport and I kind of do whatever I want. So that's not cool. And two cases illustrate just how tragic and how simple this problem is and how tragic the outcome is. And if there had been compliance with a very clear regulation, these cases wouldn't have probably occurred. My last point is, I think this is wildly underreported. You know, there's not a lot of data on this, mostly because I think, whoops, I didn't see it there. Okay, I got you now. You know, I think pilots kind of negotiate it with themselves over the radio. They avoid something, which of course is great. Back to the NASA illustration, you know, sometimes things go well and we should celebrate that. But it's probably underreported. And it's a little bit of, you know, Vegas rules. What happened in the traffic pattern stays in the traffic pattern. People land, and you know, one pilot may be departing, doing a, like the airplane pilot here, doing a right downwind departure and all of that. Nevertheless, I think as a matter of fundamental flight standards, operations are safer, particularly at uncontrolled airports, when we follow the 91-126 provisions. I'd be happy to address any questions or comments. I think I may be nearly the last person for the day. Got one more. Okay. Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. All right, as we come around to the close of the day, I will point out a couple things. You know, as Phil was discussing, there are a couple of the altitude items as it relates to helicopters and helicopter operations. One thing to keep consideration that within helicopters, we have about 53 different mission segments within the helicopter industry. HAI defined that years ago. And some of them are slightly different than others. One thing I do want to point out regulatory-wise, an FAR, is that Part 135 helicopters over a congested area are allowed to go down to 300 feet AGL. That is a rule. And that is not OPSPEC, that's not guidance, that's not policy. That is in fact a regulation, 135-203B. And so, you know, when we talk about and have presentations up here regarding UAS and integration, we actually had this topic brought up in this room several years ago in the FAA's International Safety Symposium. Asked the question, how did we get to a point? How did we get to a point where the US community was at 400 feet, but the Part 135 air carrier helicopter fleet can by regulation go down with a full load of passengers over downtown Dallas at 300 feet? And that question to date has still not been answered. So I challenge, of course, the regulatory bodies, the operators and so forth, and I'm not advocating changing a lot of things. There's time and a place for everything. When we talk about 250, 200-foot helicopters, let's think about power lines. Let's think about gas inspection. I fly FLIR and LiDAR and a bunch of other things that we do, and we're down to those ranges because it's a purposeful intent. So like you said, what Phil was saying, it's people that just go do these things. There are regulatory elements that can drive us to be there or drive us to be away from those points. So I think it's very important that we recognize the embodiment of all 53 missions of helicopters and we do it safely. And if there's things that have to be changed, we need to have kind of circle the tables and have those discussions, and it should happen. And that's the whole point of having this conference. Go into our last speaker, our final for the day. We're going to come back in. I'm going to have Jeff Smith from the FAA come up. And his presentation is regulatory compliance philosophy. Has it been working and how has it been received? I'll tell you a little bit about compliance philosophy or the compliance program. Again, one of those things that were early, Michael Huerta was the administrator at the time. In this room, we had one of the early announcements of compliance philosophy, and it was well received because at the time we had SMS programs that we were touting just culture for the operator, right? Just culture was, but the FAA didn't have a just culture parallel. And so you would have operators where we would say, hey, he didn't have intent, let's train it, let's make sure they're better. But the FAA would, of course, embody a violation to someone or at least going through an LOI process, and that doesn't match. The FAA embraced the compliance philosophy process, and I, for one, applauded them. I thought that was a great move. So if you'd come up and give them a nice talk for it, I would greatly appreciate it. Again, Jeff Smith, the FAA. A round of applause, please.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate it. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Randy, I appreciate that introduction. And in fact, I was sitting in here listening to presentations from earlier today and saying things about just culture and SMS. I was thinking, great, because that leads right into what we're going to discuss today as part of the compliance program. So appreciate everyone who's here in attendance and everyone who's listening virtually. So thank you. My name is Jeffrey Smith. I'm with the FAA. I'm an aviation safety inspector, an operations inspector. Started off at the South Florida FSDO, ultimately worked up to headquarters, and now I lead the team that is responsible for implementing the policy and training and messaging surrounding the compliance program within the Flight Standards Service. Okay, very good. So quick presentation overview there. We're going to talk about the compliance program, a little bit of oversight, evolution, how we got to where we're at today. Some practical applications, the investigation process, and some actions that you might see from the FAA, and then an illustrative example. Then we'll talk about some measurements towards the end. Okay, so disclaimer, this helps me keep out of hot water with my FAA legal counsel here. So this information is general information on the compliance program. Now, the compliance program does apply to all program offices in the FAA that have a regulatory oversight function, to include flight standards, which a lot of you may interact with. Some of you all may interact more with the Office of Airports or with aircraft certification. And the overall foundation of the compliance program is going to be the same throughout the agency, but there are some nuances because we have different regulatory oversight roles, different processes, different tools that we use. But in general, though, everything that you see here is applicable across the board, but those nuances for flight standards will become apparent, and that's what this presentation is centric on. Obviously, the information that I present to you here isn't meant to restrict what the FAA may or may not do in an actual case. You can't say, hey, this Jeff Smith guy told us this. They're going to say, Jeff who? But just keep that in mind here. And each event is unique and addressed based on the known facts of a particular case. So we've got some examples here, but they're pretty basic. Okay, so the overview. The compliance program provides the overarching guidance for implementing the FAA's safety oversight approach. That's a mouthful. What does that mean? Well, the FAA does a few things, right? It
It does certifications, it does safety promotion, but it also does oversight, as you know, right? Surveillance, investigations, that sort. And that's where the compliance program comes in. It's designed to meet the challenges of today's rapidly changing aerospace system. Things are happening pretty quickly. Regulations can't necessarily keep up with the changes in the industry, and our approach to regulatory oversight needed to change to match that. It represents overall a shift from the traditional enforcement-based model that we had prior to the compliance program. And now we're using a model that generally employs compliance actions or non-enforcement actions to address issues like simple mistakes, flawed procedures, and that sort. And we'll talk some more detail about that as we go through the slides. So the compliance program intends to find problems in the national airspace system before they result in an incident or accident. And we can take action to address those, to use the most appropriate tools to address regulatory violations, monitor the situation to make sure that the situation stays fixed. And if there is a problem, human or mechanical, the FAA, the industry, all of us in this room want to know about it, learn from it, take action to prevent any future reoccurrence and to keep things safe in the NAS. Okay, so what are the objectives of the compliance program? Well, we want to promote compliance with established regulatory standards. Of course, the regulatory standards being kind of the baseline for what we consider safe operations, but to also encourage the highest levels of safety. So going beyond what the regulations might have and encouraging people to take action based upon the risk that may be for your particular operation. It was mentioned earlier today several times about safety management type principles. Trying to look ahead, trying to stay proactive. We want to foster an open and transparent exchange of safety information. Again, we all do better when we're talking, when we're learning from each other. Events like this, or just one-on-one with perhaps your local field office. Using remedial measures, retraining, or enforcement as applicable for matters related to competency or qualification. Taking strong legal action for intentional, reckless, or criminal acts. Again, we'll get into some more details on these in the upcoming slides. Pursuing legal enforcement when required by law, and employing a just culture approach. Okay, so the compliance program is an FAA priority. What I've got on the screen there is a quote from former FAA Administrator Michael Huerta. Mr. Huerta was the administrator when the compliance program, at the time, compliance philosophy was being rolled out. So this isn't something that I came up with, or a group of us kind of low-level staffers within the FAA came up with and are trying to push upward. This is something that is coming from the top down and has been, even though we have had new administrators come through. So before the compliance program, to do some compare and contrast, prior we focused on enforcement and gathering items of proof. And enforcement action was really the primary means to address or respond to a regulatory violation. And that response that we had, the type of penalty or the length of suspension, I should say, would be based upon the outcome or what the potential outcome would have been. Now, under the compliance program, we focus on using, where able, non-enforcement methods to address the deviation or respond to it. And a compliance action will be taken unless we make a determination that an enforcement action is necessary. And the focus is on corrective actions that properly address the risk. And those actions are going to be based on underlying behaviors. So there's an emphasis on information exchange and the use of safety management principles. And the FAA's willingness to forego legal action is a benefit of the program, but not its primary intent. So if prior to the compliance program, you might have received an enforcement action, and now it would be a compliance action. One could see that as a benefit, right? But that's not necessarily the intent. It's not going easy on non-compliance, and it's not the proverbial get out of jail free card. Even with a compliance action, there's an expectation that corrective actions will be taken, again, to prevent the situation from happening again. Okay, so a little bit about how we got here. So, what was baked into the compliance program as it was being developed? Well, the effects of voluntary safety programs and the success that we've seen with those programs, principles of system safety, and strategic initiatives such as risk-based decision-making. Also, the roadmap to a just culture as an example of some literature that was available on enhancing the safety environment. And that was produced by the Flight Safety Foundation and Flight Safety Digest, March of 2005, if you're interested in looking that up, and talks a lot about just culture up there. So again, a lot that went into our decision-making on rolling out the compliance program. So expectations. So the FAA system is based on and dependent upon adherence with regulations, again, as the bare minimum. And all of us in the room have the statutory obligation to comply with regulatory standards. And this obligation includes a duty to develop and use processes and procedures that will prevent deviation from the regulations, as well as to taking steps to ensure continued compliance, not just being in compliance with regulations or other safety standards just by luck or happenstance, but actually being deliberate about it. So the compliance program, again, you'll see this through a few slides, intends to foster that open and transparent exchange of safety information, want to be open, taking a engaged response to deviations, having those that are involved with the deviation be part of the decision-making process on what the corrective actions should be, and dealing with those specific safety issues with an exchange of information. And what we're hoping to see by that is that the compliance program is instrumental both in ensuring compliance with the regulations as well as identifications of hazards and management of risk. Because we could have some hazards, some risks that are out there that are outside of what is controlled for by a regulation. So increased sharing of safety data. So that transparent exchange of safety information allows us to better identify emerging hazards and the prediction of risk, and allows system improvements to occur on an ongoing, proactive basis rather than reactive after a major mishap or an investigation. And that's been talked about again throughout these presentations, is trying to stay proactive with finding issues, or maybe even take an action that isn't necessarily required by the regulation. And also just this open exchange of safety information, which can occur, again, dealing with your local office, or can be even something like a forum like this, where we're exchanging information, and part of the compliance program that intends to foster all of that discussion. So we've seen some benefits of sharing of information, and you can see some of the initiatives that are there on the screen. You're probably familiar with most of them. Okay, so taking a just culture approach, and I've heard that term used throughout presentations here that I've seen today. And concept of just culture has an expectation and appreciation for the self-disclosure of errors. There was an example that was provided earlier today involving a wire strike. Not necessarily that would have been hidden, but the individual that was talking, owned that, and then went back to the company and made some changes in the company that helped prevent that from occurring in the future. And so honest mistakes do occur, and we know that. And it's not that it's a no blame culture where it's not anyone's fault, but when mistakes occur, there has to be some ownership of it and accountability of it moving forward, because we know that even the unintentional errors can have some serious consequences in a complex system like we have in the National Airspace System. So a little bit of an eye chart there, and sorry for that. We have a laser pointer, but it's probably going to be hard to do on both screens at the same time. But essentially what we're showing here in the blue are the voluntary safety program initiatives. So the one that's at the very bottom, that long blue one there, is ASRS, the Aviation Safety Reporting System, or otherwise known as the NASA reports. And that started back in 1975, which, as you know, has an incentive for reporting information. And as long as it's an accepted report, can be used to preclude, not an enforcement action being levied, but the penalties of an enforcement action, right? So you disclose some information, the FAA takes that as a benefit. We all benefit from that information that comes from ASRS. But as an incentive to reporting that, you won't be charged with an enforcement or won't have that penalty. And then there are other voluntary programs that have come after that to include VDRP, to include ASAP, along with some others. What's there in the purple or dark pink color is legislation that has been passed with respect to the protection of information. So 40123, protection of voluntarily submitted information, which helps support VDRP and ASAP, as well as 44735, which helps protect safety management system information. And then in the green, we have other voluntary initiatives. So InfoShare being an example there, CAS, GAJSC, and that sort. So we've got a lot of things that we've put into place as an industry and as a government body to have an exchange of information, to have an open dialogue about potential safety issues. And what you see at the bottom is the fatal accident rate within the United States. And you can see that that is decreasing. The blue line at the very bottom being the number of accidents, and the red being the fatalities. And you can see that that has been steadily coming down since the time there on the slide, which is, I think, 1982. And we'll see that here. The big yellow block that is on the right side there shows the overlay of the compliance philosophy or program, which was implemented in 2015. So if we break those numbers down, what do we see? A 78% decline in the number of fatalities since 1982. 68% decline in the total number of accidents since that year as well. Now, there's some caveats with that. There's many factors that contribute to the accident rate and the fatal accident rate, the number of fatalities, right? And correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, and we know that. But the compliance program is founded on the idea that voluntary safety programs do have a positive effect on improving safety. Certainly, those voluntary programs that we showed on the previous slide have not caused the accident rate to go up. So again, part of the reasoning for the compliance program or what went into its foundation. Okay, so global alignments. Again, I don't think we're necessarily alone in the world here on the compliance program. The overall aviation community, ICAO, does encourage safety management system constructs, and we believe that the compliance program is in line with those. It's also aligned with ICAO's GAS, or Global Aviation Safety Plan, and you can see the quote there from the GAS documentation. Okay, so a practical application of the compliance program. What does that look like? All right, well, as we all know, most of us, the regulations do provide for some allowance and deviation with rules when it comes to an emergency. So Part 91, 91.3b, and in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. So we're familiar with that. Oops. Okay. So some things that we have from the pilot controller glossary. We know we have an emergency, which is a distress or urgency situation. Distress being more imminent, urgency being maybe leading up to something. So what does the AIM tell us? Well, it tells us that we should declare a state of urgency sooner rather than later. We should, request that assistance, and that requesting that assistance when needed is an act that is in the interest of safety. In fact, we as pilots who become apprehensive for any reason should request assistance from air traffic control, ideally before the situation deteriorates into a state of distress. As we know, as we've talked about in some previous examples throughout the day, delay can potentially result in an accident or loss of life. And ATC can provide help in the form of radio, radar, direction finding station, other aircraft, whatnot. Okay. So why might a pilot not want to take advantage of that? Well, several reasons. One may be the perception that, hey, if I declare an emergency or I seek assistance, that may lead towards a punitive action or a fear of being unfairly criticized. And that's, a fear that is out there, certainly. And it is true that pilots and operators, you can't use the emergency provisions as an excuse for failing to comply with the regulations. However, if there is a deviation, if there's a investigation that comes after the declaration of an emergency, the FAA is going to apply its compliance program policies. It's going to apply a just culture in analyzing that situation. So as an example, to drive that home a little bit, pilot operating under VFR encounters deteriorating weather conditions, and they enter into controlled airspace without an IFR. So what might the pilot do in response to that? Well, could contact ATC for assistance, could execute an emergency procedure to escape the IMC, could land at an unplanned location, or could climb the aircraft to remain clear of terrain, or some combination of those actions that are there. And and if the pilot declares that emergency and it comes to the attention of the FAA, perhaps through the Flight Standards District Office, through air traffic control, some things that would be looked at in the investigation, pilot's due diligence on checking weather information, exercising other appropriate decision-making in the form of available information that's there during that time. And we would see if there's any other requirements, as again, part of the specific facts of that case that would require enforcement action. However, if enforcement's not required, it seems like the pilot did a reasonable job on the free flight, just happened to encounter that inadvertent weather and had to declare an emergency to escape it. Compliance action is a likely outcome from that. So what I'm trying to drive home here is that we shouldn't be worried about declaring an emergency because of fear of having an enforcement action taken. Again, there are some criteria for enforcement action, but as you'll see, we're resolving most things with a compliance action. So we should do what we need to do to stay alive, keep our passengers alive, and that sort, and not be directly worried about an enforcement action. One of the stories that I heard as we were implementing the compliance program, was right around that time, was an instructor. She was with a student. They were hover taxiing a helicopter at a controlled airport. ATC advised them as they were taxiing to hold short of an intersecting taxiway. When the instructor looked up, apparently the student had not adhered to stopping at that point and was proceeding onto the taxiway that they were supposed to be holding short of. The instructor takes the controls of the rotorcraft, tries to stop and move the aircraft back to the taxiway that they were supposed to be on. This resulted in a loss of control of the helicopter, and they end up putting it into a ditch sitting next to the taxiway. As part of the post-incident interview, the instructor was asked why. Did you take the controls abruptly like that? Did you see crossing traffic? She said, no, I was just worried that if ATC saw that I had crossed onto this taxiway, I was worried they were going to take my certificates and it was going to ruin my career. Had she known about the compliance program, maybe she would not have had that reaction. Maybe there wouldn't have been the damage to the aircraft. Another story, a few years after that, 135, I believe, but don't hold me to that, pilot was given a altitude to climb to. They end up busting through that altitude by several hundred feet. They turn the transponder off, come back down to the altitude that was assigned, turn the transponder back on. ATC reports the pilot deviation. The subsequent investigation reveals that the pilot did in fact intentionally turn the transponder off. They may have had a co-pilot that provided a statement. I don't remember all the details. But the pilot said, the reason I did that was I was afraid I was going to get an enforcement action for the pilot deviation, and that's why I acted the way that I did. Would they have done that had they known about the compliance program? Again, I don't know, but I know by intentionally turning that transponder off, that put them in you know, a different arena that they would have otherwise been. They got themselves into more trouble. So there are some really practical application, I would say, or implications of the compliance program, and I think we should be promoting that throughout the community. Okay. Investigations and actions. So what does the overall process look like? Well, you can see here, we've got an example of a brochure, and some of you may have seen it. In fact, we just changed the look of the brochure. A lot of the content is still the same, but you can check that out. And the brochure talks about our evolution towards a just culture. It also talks about your rights. And many of you have heard of the Pilot's Bill of Rights, and that information is included in this brochure as well. And of course, you're free to exercise your rights. We all are, without fear of repercussions. So that may include obtaining legal counsel or wanting some clarification from the FAA inspector or other personnel that you're working with. So those rights are embedded there in the brochure. You should expect to receive that. Pilot's Bill of Rights, actual legislation, says the FAA has to provide PBR information, Pilot Bill of Rights information, if it looks like the FAA is going to be moving towards enforcement action. But as a policy matter, flight standards, because of feedback from industry, gives the brochure out at the onset of any investigation, in large part to advise people of what their rights are, to include the availability of air traffic data. So you should expect to get that brochure. You can find it on our website. Looks like we're missing a W there in it, but it is www.faa.gov/go/CP for compliance program. You can find that brochure. You can find some other information on there as well. Okay, so you can expect the FAA to appropriately investigate any charge of regulatory or statutory deviation. Okay, that's part of our mandate. But we should be evaluating the facts of the particular case, and we should be seeking to utilize the best tool to fix the problem and follow up when necessary. And you can see the diagram there on the right side, kind of a simplified version of what you might get from the FAA, what you should get from the FAA. So identify the non-compliance, seek to determine if compliance action is appropriate, yes, no. If no, we're down the enforcement route. If yes, obviously the compliance action route. But in either case, notice that bottom decision point is the problem fixed. So this is where it's not the get out of jail free card necessarily. There is an expectation that, again, corrective action will be taken. And that loop can continue until the problem, the underlying root cause, is in fact addressed. Okay, so the decision process overview. We've talked a little bit about some of these terms, but let's go into some more detail. Compliance action. Taken for violation resulting from flawed procedures, simple mistakes, lack of understanding, diminished skills. Legal enforcement action. This is required for violations resulting from intentional, reckless, or criminal acts. Okay, there's a few other triggers we'll talk about here in a moment. And administrative action, and maybe somewhere in between. It's where legal enforcement isn't required, but doesn't seem like a compliance action is going to take care of the situation. The more formal notice of the deviation. Okay, so let's take a look at compliance actions and what you might see here. So again, purpose of a compliance action, restore compliance and identify and correct the underlying causes that have led to the deviation, which is really what we want to do. We want to get to those root causes. It's intended to be used as an open and transparent exchange of safety information between you and the FAA personnel or whoever's being investigated and FAA personnel. And again, if the individual or company even is willing and able, compliance action is likely. We'll talk about exceptions to that, of course, as we go through. So what are some examples of compliance actions? Well, an on-the-spot correction. That's just a quick fix. Simple mistake, we're able to address it right there on the spot. And where we don't need to have additional follow-up to confirm that the situation has been addressed. So examples there. I'm out doing a inspection of a Part 141 pilot school, looking through the records. I see a stage check has been done, wasn't appropriately signed off by the assistant chief instructor. They sign it, we're all good, right? or ramp check someone and they're doing some multiple flights for the day and they say, oops, I don't have my pilot certificate, but it's back in my hangar there. Let me go grab it. Or they print out a temporary authority to act as pilot. Okay, so that resolves the situation. So on the spot correction. Counseling. So that may be used by FAA personnel to clarify a person's understanding, convey regulatory information, best practices. Of course, the regs and provide the baseline framework, but there's other things, handbooks, ACs, other things that help provide some supplementary information. So some counseling may be involved in, talking about those as well. Additional training, which can include remedial training, and that involves the FAST team, but it could also be an organization's approved training program. So have, Part 135 training program, someone has a deviation, perhaps you're running them through a particular portion of that initial training program again, or if the company has recurrent training, putting them through that. Other required training for their job function, like driving privileges at an airport, or maybe side of badge training comes to mind as well for that. Or the FAA safety team remedial training process. So that's where investigating inspector recommends a person for remedial training. It goes over to the FAST team program manager. FAST team program manager develops a syllabus and outline for training, and that training is executed. Or other actions. So we're not trying to restrict the corrective actions that can be taken to resolve the situation. So anything that addresses the underlying root cause can be considered as a compliance action. So if you have a company, let's say, we're going to use the example of a pilot school, perhaps they amend their training manual to prevent the deviation from occurring in the future. We can also consider corrective actions that have already been taken by the individual. I've read some documentation where it's been, say, a pilot deviation, and the inspector interviews the pilot, and they said, yep, right after the deviation, I realized I messed up. I got my flight instructor, we did some additional ground, we did some additional flight. Here's my logbook showing that. Great, and we're done, okay? So that gets documented as well. And everyone is encouraged to take proactive steps to identify and address any known safety issues, not necessarily wait for the FAA to call. Okay, so that's compliance actions. Now let's take a look at enforcement actions. So what might trigger an enforcement action? Well, an intentional act, okay? Somebody knows it was wrong to take that action, or they knew it was wrong not to take a particular action. Okay, we know it's contrary to regulation or statute, intentional. That's going to put someone in the enforcement action realm. Reckless conduct. So just an indifference to or disregard of safety standards, we've been talking about low flying here. I'm just going to fly 100 feet, above the canyon, whatever. Not going to worry about it, okay? Maybe a reckless act. Failure to complete corrective action. So someone says, yep, we're going to do this. The company says, yep, we're going to make these fixes, and they don't make those fixes, okay? That puts them into the enforcement action. Legal enforcement action required by regulation or law. There's just some regulations or statutes that say we have to take enforcement action. Obviously, that would be a requirement for enforcement. Conduct creating or threatening to create an unacceptable risk to safety. So there are some times where the FAA says this kind of behavior is just not condonable and it will result in an enforcement action. We normally put those at the end of Order 2150.3, which is the FAA's compliance and enforcement order, and their enforcement bulletins that go at the end of that order. And you could call that order up and take a look at those. One that you would see in there right now, if you were to look at it, involves unruly passengers. So you probably heard about that, certainly on the news. And the FAA, early last year, said that that unruly passenger conduct is simply unacceptable, and anyone who is found in violation of interfering with crew members will receive an enforcement action in the form of a civil penalty. And that's listed there in that enforcement bulletin, excuse me. You can find data on such cases, just as kind of an aside. If you do an internet search for FAA and unruly passengers, you can see the number of actions that have been taken. Okay, so now there's some areas where there's discretion on whether or not legal enforcement action has to be used. So top bullet there, multiple non-compliance of various sections or subsections of the same or similar regulations discovered during a single inspection. I pulled some of this language directly out of our policy. So what does that mean? Well, FAA inspector shows up, let's say, and perhaps an inspection was missed. And that aircraft's flown multiple times. Well, multiple deviations, have occurred. So depending on the circumstances, compliance action still could be used for that. I'll skip down to the bottom one, non-compliance with different sections or subsections of a regulation from a root cause. So maybe I flew an aircraft and something was wrong with the equipment, and maybe I've violated the reg on flying an unairworthy aircraft, as well as the reg that requires specific aircraft to be installed and operable in the plane. So multiple violations there, but really they're resulting from the same root cause. Now, the one in the middle there, sorry for them being out of order, recurring non-compliance with the same or similar section discovered during multiple or successive inspections. So you get an inspection, you get checked, deviation, tries to get resolved with a compliance action, it comes back, another day, again, same kind of deviation, and again, now we're moving closer towards enforcement action. But these are areas where enforcement action is discretionary on the part of the FAA. Let's see, non-accurate data. So information that is contained in data systems, if there's a system corruption there as well, or just data has been entered in that is incorrect. Maybe legal, maybe not, depending on whether that information was entered intentionally wrong, or it was just real neglect on the part of the company to keep that system up. Okay, so administrative action. So we'll take an administrative action when FAA personnel determine that compliance action isn't going to work, but a legal enforcement action isn't necessary, and kind of in the middle of those two. Two types of administrative actions. One is a warning notice, and just advises of the non-compliance and requests future compliance. Hey, you did this wrong, don't do it again. Here's your formal warning, okay? Warning notices would generally be used for individuals. Letters of correction, kind of the same thing, but they also note a specific agreement or corrective action that needs to be taken. Sometimes that corrective action might have already been done, and it's just a way to formalize that. And again, provide that formal notice to the operator. We normally see letters of correction issued to entities other than individuals, businesses, whatnot. Okay, so some various actions, degraded skills and ability. Well, maybe a compliance action, remedial training perhaps, or an administrative action, you need to get, those skills up, or hey, you violated the reg and you don't do that again. Instances where the investigation shows that the certificate holder has a lack of care, judgment, or responsibility, that's going to be an enforcement action there, perhaps revocation. Or there's a question of competency. So FAA is investigating, and we don't really know, what the issue might be. That might prompt a re-examination, 44-7. Okay, so an example here, again, kind of a rudimentary one, but I think it ties in what we've been talking about together here. So we've got a pilot departs on a cross-country flight in a helicopter. Upon takeoff, there's less than the minimum amount of fuel on board in violation of 91-151. No person may begin a flight in a rotorcraft under VFR conditions unless there's enough fuel to fly at the first point of intended landing, and assuming normal cruising speed, to fly after that for at least 20 minutes. Aircraft runs out of fuel, pilot is forced to make an unscheduled landing. So, what are the outcomes? Well, we see on the left-hand side, scenario outcome 1. There happens to be an airport nearby. Great. Pilot's able to land at that airport. Helicopter is refueled. Pilot and passengers continue to their destination without further incident. Outcome 2. There is no airport nearby or other suitable landing spot. Pilot's forced to land in an unapproved field. Helicopter's damaged. Passenger suffers a broken leg. Okay? Now, regardless of the outcome, we have to deal with the underlying behaviors that led to the running out of fuel. We need to find out why that is. We need to address that. And investigative personnel, and I would say the pilot as well, need to control for severity bias. So what do I mean by severity bias? Well, it'd be very easy for us to look at scenario outcome one and say, no big deal, you know, pilot and passengers got to where they were going, no one was hurt, you know, who cares, right? But if that underlying behavior that led to the pilot running out of fuel or running low on fuel isn't addressed, then that may show up again in a future flight, and that future flight's outcome may not be so good. So we want to address that underlying cause. It'd also be easy for us to look at scenario two and say, okay, we've got someone who suffered a broken leg, we've got some bent metal out here, we're really going to lay the hammer down. Again, the compliance program compels us to try to avoid that severity bias. Again, focus on the underlying behaviors that led to the event. So what might the investigation reveal? That the handheld fuel quantity gauge used during the pre-flight was intended for a different model. I will admit, this is a scenario that I originally developed for fixed wing. I called my rotorcraft friend and I said, hey, look, does this make sense for the rotorcraft community? He said, well, maybe sort of, some might have a handheld fuel stick, some might be homemade, whatever. So I hope you all permit me for using this example here, just kind of as an illustration. But we're looking at why did this pilot take off with an insufficient amount of fuel? One reason might be that they just had the wrong fuel indicator that they used to check the fuel prior to going up, okay? It may be that the aircraft personnel did not fuel the helicopter as requested, and the pilot failed to confirm that quantity before starting the helicopter up and taking off. It could be that, they thought they had enough fuel, and the reason that they thought they had enough fuel was because of their calculations during the pre-flight on what the ground speed would be. So they made some miscalculations there. Perhaps they're unable to interpret the approved flight manual, which provides the charts and fuel consumption rates and whatnot, maybe due to a lapse in English language proficiency. Or we could find that the pilot just has a general disregard for the regulations, okay? So all of these different root causes have different potential solutions to them. Again, whether or not it was a good outcome, pilot was able to, put the rotorcraft down at an airport and refuel, or a bad outcome where they ended up crashing the aircraft, we need to find out what the root cause was and address that. Okay, so we might see a compliance action in the form of an on-the-spot correction with the incorrect quantity indicator, the handheld quantity indicator that says gauge, probably should be indicator, handheld. Aircraft owner replaced the incorrect fuel quantity stick with the right one, okay? Wrote the tail number on there maybe, and that way it doesn't get mixed up again. Great. Perhaps there's some counseling. So the pilot failed to check the fuel level prior to flight. Maybe sitting down with an FAA inspector, going over the reasons for the pre-flight, making sure they understand their responsibilities with respect to pre-flight action, any regulations associated with that. So again, counseling. Remedial training. So this gets to the incorrect the incorrect ground speed calculation. And the person those skills have lapsed since they got their private pilot certificate, let's say. And so the FAST team program manager develops a syllabus, gets them with a flight or ground instructor, and they go over this, and the person gets those skills back up. Or it could be a re-examination if there's an English language proficiency and we're not sure if that was the cause of the issue. They're unable to interpret the flight manual, and perhaps we re-examine their English language skills. Where we might have the potential or discretionary legal enforcement action is a history of inadequate pre-flight and repeated non-compliance with established regulations. So, this pilot, maybe has done some other things, maybe not necessarily with inadequate fuel, but some other issues as far as not doing their due diligence and meeting the regs with respect to pre-flight action and becoming informed of the information pertinent to the flight. And this may result in a formal warning notice, okay? Tried to work with the individual before, don't seem to be getting it. We're escalating our response now to a warning letter. Or the investigation reveals the pilot was under the influence of alcohol, which certainly would trigger a legal enforcement action. The other thing too would be if the investigation reveals that the pilot was in a rush and they knew they had less than the minimum required amount of fuel and they elected to take off anyway. Would probably be the better example to have there. In either case, though, legal enforcement action would be taken. Okay, so to reiterate a previous point, the FAA is not going easy on non-compliance, and it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's really about trying to be smarter about the actions that were taken and promoting exchange of information. Okay, some measurements and what we've seen thus far. So we implemented the program in October of 2015, and since then, just within the Flight Standards Service, we've initiated over 40,000 compliance actions to address regulatory non-compliance. And in that same time period, we've taken 4,700 legal enforcement actions and 3,500 administrative actions. So when we add that up and do the math, we conclude that over 80% of known regulatory violations have been addressed through the, or with a compliance action, excuse me. All right, so compliance actions can resolve issues more safely, at least get them closed out. So when we take a look at Q2 of last fiscal year, we see that it took us 23 days from start to finish for compliance actions, just based on when our documentation was started and closed in our system. Contrast that with enforcement action. That should probably be legal enforcement action. We're looking at 142 days. So the compliance program isn't necessarily intended to move things faster, but there is a benefit to that, certainly, right? Anytime we can identify what the root cause is and have those corrective actions taken sooner rather than later, that's great, because then we don't have that risk in the system. Also, too, no one wants an enforcement or an investigation hanging over their head, right? So a little bit of stress reduction there. Also, if we're resolving compliance actions quicker, then that helps us reserve the resources that we might need for an enforcement action. Unfortunately, there are some bad actors that are out there. None are in this room. You all are here because you care about safety, but that's not the case for all participants in the NAS. And where action needs to be taken for those bad actors, we want to have the resources to do so. And so, again, the compliance actions are resolving things a little bit closer, or sooner rather. The 142 days, I will note that now with the compliance program, the enforcement actions that we're taking are going to be for those more egregious, perhaps more complex cases, which is going to add some time to processing them. Okay, so then, you know, whether we're taking compliance actions, enforcement, administrative, you know, is that having the intended effect? Are we preventing non-compliance from occurring again? And what we have seen and analyzed thus far with respect to individuals, answer is yes. So recidivism, fancy word, of course, for repeat offenses. When we look at individuals in the same type of violation, we see less than 1% committing the same type. So of everyone who had an action before, and we look and see if they have a subsequent action, again, less than 1% are coming back in for the same type of deviation. So again, maybe they've stopped operating, or maybe they're just better at not getting caught now, but in any event, from what we've seen and the actions we've taken, less than 1% are repeating a non-compliance. And the compliance program, as I've mentioned a few times, intends to foster the open and transparent exchange of information between the FAA and the industry and the community. And this can be through general correspondence, part of an investigation, or as part of a voluntary reporting program. Now, the compliance program and these established voluntary reporting programs are certainly separate, but looking at the numbers for the voluntary programs can provide some insight. And we see that for ASAP, BDRP, and ASRS, since we've implemented the program, those numbers have gone up. They were already on the rise even before the compliance program, but the compliance program certainly hasn't detracted from the use of those programs. Of course, as you might imagine, slight dip with COVID as operations decreased for a time period. But overall, we've seen a steady increase there from the report. And with that, I think that takes us to the last slide. It does there. So again, compliance program information can be found on our public-facing website, www.faa.gov/go/CP. If you want to get a hold of me, there's my email there. Pretty simple. Or you can reach my team and I at the email that is below there. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Yeah, short answer is I don't know, because that's, sure, I'm sorry. What percentage of ASRS or ASAP reports are either accepted or not accepted? How does that fall? And I simply don't know. My understanding is the number that are not accepted is relatively low. Yeah, I would say that that we see more instances with individuals, and within the individuals, pilot deviations are the number one, the type of deviation that we see. For non-individual entities, the biggest thing that we see is failure to follow procedures is what we have. In terms of the percentages of how those numbers break out between actions were taken against individuals versus entities, I don't have that readily available. You're welcome.
Are compliance actions recorded in PRIA?
They are not reported in PRIA. They are not part of that reporting system, but they are stored in FAA database information. And a closed compliance action, just like a closed enforcement or administrative action, is subject to release through FOIA. Correct. No, not PRIA, FOIA. You're welcome. And right now, the FAA flight standards, let me be specific, I don't want to speak out of turn, is not expunging information on compliance actions, but NARA, National Archives and Records Administration, has recently approved a schedule that will allow us to start expunging that information. And it looks like we're going to be doing it on a 3-year basis. Thank you. Very welcome, Randy. Thank you all.
All right, well, that rounds out day 2 of the conference for everybody. Everybody online, thank you very much for tuning in and watching a nice long day. I know for a lot of folks around the globe, some are early in the morning, late at night. So thank you very much, folks in the room. Thank you for your attention and also all the participation. We really appreciate it. I'm sure the speakers appreciate it. Have a good evening tonight. Tomorrow starts at 0800, 8 a.m. is when the classes start. In this room, we'll be starting out with safety management systems for small operators. So with any additional questions, if anybody has anything, I'll be off to the side here momentarily. Happy to answer any questions for you for the upcoming events. Other than that, have a great night. Take care.